For nearly 900 days, a city of millions was starved, frozen, and bombarded, yet still it refused to fall. It was September 1941 when the city once called St. Petersburg, jewel of the Russian Empire and heart of culture, knowledge, and revolution, fell under a shadow that would last for nearly 900 days. The Siege of Leningrad was unlike any other ordeal of the Second World War, not just a battle of armies, but a trial of endurance where civilians became soldiers of survival, fighting not with rifles or artillery, but with their will to live. Encircled by the German Wehrmacht and their allies, cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union, Leningrad was bombarded daily from the skies and shelled from the ground. Food supplies vanished, fuel disappeared, and the bitter cold of Russian winters froze the city into a landscape of hunger and silence. Families burned furniture for warmth, children clutched empty bread rations that weighed less than a few mouthfuls, and across the city, starvation claimed lives by the hundreds of thousands. Yet, even in the darkest moments, the people of Leningrad endured. The city's factories continued to produce weapons, its musicians played symphonies under siege, and the famed Road of Life over the frozen Lake Ladoga became the lifeline that kept the city from complete annihilation. This was not merely a siege, it was a test of civilization itself, a struggle between destruction and resilience, where survival became victory. Tonight we will trace the entire siege of Leningrad, from the German advance to the desperate winter of 1941, from the bravery of those who risked everything to bring supplies across the ice, to the final lifting of the blockade in 1944. We will hear the human stories of soldiers who fought in the ruins, of mothers who buried their children in frozen earth, of leaders who refused to abandon their people. And as we begin this journey into one of history's greatest epics of endurance, I want to ask you, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Share your location and local time in the comments below, and let us see how many parts of the world are gathering here together to relive the entire siege of Leningrad, where hunger, courage, and human spirit battled against the longest winter of war. On June 22nd, 1941, as dawn broke across Europe, the largest invasion in history erupted along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 500,000 Axis allies, surged into the Soviet Union in a storm of steel, fire, and dust. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa was conceived not only as a military campaign, but as a war of annihilation, intended to crush Bolshevism and seize vast living space for the Reich. The German war machine poured forward with 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 aircraft, orchestrating the devastating doctrine of blitzkrieg. Soviet border defenses crumbled under the weight of the assault, their communication networks shattered, and their units encircled before they could regroup. Panic swept through Soviet ranks, as entire divisions were cut off, captured, or destroyed within days. Yet beyond the chaos, behind the burning frontier towns and shattered armies, loomed a target of immense symbolic and strategic importance: Leningrad. To Hitler, the city was more than an industrial hub. It was the cradle of the 1917 revolution, the symbolic heart of communism. Its destruction would send shockwaves through the Soviet state and strike at the very legitimacy of Stalin's rule. From the very first week of Barbarossa, Leningrad was marked for death. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, was tasked with delivering this fatal blow to the city on the Neva. Lieb's force comprised over 700,000 men, including the battle-hardened 16th and 18th Armies, along with the formidable Panzer Group 4 under Erich Hoppner. These formations were equipped with modern tanks like the Panzer III and IV. Supported by motorized infantry and artillery, that gave the Germans unrivaled mobility. Facing them was the Red Army's northwestern front, weakened by Stalin's purges of the officer corps and hampered by obsolete equipment. Soviet troops were spread thin, many armed with outdated rifles and supported by tanks like the T-26 and BT-7, which were no match for German armor in open combat. From East Prussia and occupied Poland, Lieb's men surged into the Baltic states, shattering Soviet resistance in Lithuania and Latvia within days. The Luftwaffe quickly established dominance, bombing Soviet airfields and destroying hundreds of planes on the ground. Civilians fled in panic as German panzers thundered through countryside roads, their treads crushing villages into dust. The Wehrmacht advance seemed unstoppable, and within weeks the road to Leningrad lay open. The northern arm of Barbarossa was unfolding with terrifying efficiency. The drive toward Leningrad was not merely a thrust on the map, but a campaign steeped in ideological venom. Hitler's orders were explicit. The city was to be erased, its people starved, and its legacy eradicated from history. Unlike other targets, Leningrad was not to be occupied in the traditional sense. It was to be obliterated. The German High Command believed its capture would sever Soviet access to the Baltic Sea, cripple armaments production, and sever the lifeline to the vital northern ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Moreover, Hitler understood the symbolic value of destroying the city named after Lenin, the revolutionary whose ideology had haunted him for decades. To his mind, the fall of Leningrad would strike a mortal wound at Soviet morale and weaken Stalin's grip on his people. This was total war at its most ruthless, where civilians themselves became targets of strategy. Orders circulated that survivors should not be fed, for Germany had no interest in maintaining a population it considered racially inferior. The fate of Leningrad was sealed in planning rooms in Berlin long before German soldiers saw its spires on the horizon. The city was marked for extermination, not conquest. As Army Group North stormed through the Baltic states, the Soviet defense reeled under the pace of the German advance. Cities like Riga fell within days, while key strongholds such as Pskov became battlegrounds where Red Army units attempted desperate delaying actions. Soviet commanders, unprepared for the speed and coordination of blitzkrieg, struggled to rally their shattered formations. Tanks broke down for lack of fuel, artillery was abandoned in swampy terrain, and retreat often became a route. Yet amidst the collapse, small units fought with remarkable tenacity, buying precious time with their lives. In marshes and forests, partisan bands began to harass German supply lines, laying the seeds of resistance that would grow over the coming years. Soviet civilians, caught in the whirlwind, faced occupation with terror as German forces imposed brutal measures, including executions, deportations, and the burning of villages. Still, Stalin's order was clear: Leningrad must not fall. Reinforcements were rushed from deeper inside Russia, and factories in the city itself began preparing defenses, even as refugees streamed in. The road to Leningrad was being paved in blood, and each passing day brought the German army closer to the city's gates. The geography of the northern front added both obstacles and opportunities for the attackers. The Baltic states offered good terrain for mechanized thrusts, with flat fields and road networks favoring German mobility. Yet as the panzers pushed further east, they encountered marshlands, dense forests, and rivers that slowed their pace. Supply lines stretched thin, forcing the Wehrmacht to rely heavily on horse-drawn wagons alongside their mechanized columns. The Soviet climate, with its sudden rains and muddy roads, added to the logistical strain, turning dirt tracks into quagmires that swallowed trucks whole. Still, German engineering units worked tirelessly, building bridges, repairing roads, and ensuring the advance did not stall. Soviet forces attempted to use scorched earth tactics, destroying crops, railways, and bridges as they retreated, denying resources to the invaders. The clash between modern mechanized warfare and ancient landscapes created constant friction, but the momentum of Barbarossa carried the Germans forward. Each kilometer gained brought them closer to the prize that Hitler demanded. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, but beneath the surface the seeds of exhaustion and overextension were already being sown. Leningrad itself watched the storm approach with dread and determination. Known as the Venice of the North, the city was a jewel of Russian culture, with canals, palaces, and cathedrals that symbolized centuries of history. Yet beyond its beauty lay immense industrial strength, as factories churned out tanks, artillery, and munitions vital for the Soviet war effort. Its population of nearly 3 million people became both its strength and its vulnerability, for feeding such numbers under siege would prove nearly impossible. Civil defense units began to mobilize, digging trenches, erecting barricades, and preparing the city for a fight unlike any it had ever seen. Artists, teachers, and factory workers alike joined militias, often with little more than a rifle and a single clip of ammunition. Food stocks were rationed even before the encirclement was complete, as the leadership foresaw the hardships to come. The city braced itself not only for bombs and shells, but for hunger, disease, and the terror of isolation. For the people of Leningrad, this was not simply a military threat, it was an existential struggle for survival. And as the Germans drew closer, the city's fate became entwined with the destiny of the Soviet Union itself. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals debated the precise course of action once Leningrad was reached. Some commanders, including von Lieber, argued for a direct assault to storm the city before it could fortify. Hitler, however, insisted on encirclement and starvation, believing that urban combat would sap the Wehrmacht's strength. The plan was brutal but calculated: surround the city, cut off supplies, and let hunger do what bombs could not. Orders forbade negotiations for surrender, making clear that the city's annihilation was part of the grand design of Barbarossa. German propaganda portrayed the campaign as a crusade, a cleansing of Bolshevism and the Slavic peoples who upheld it. Yet beneath the ideological fervor lay practical concerns. Germany could not afford the casualties of house-to-house fighting in a metropolis of millions. Starvation was efficient, merciless, and final. Thus, the Siege of Leningrad was conceived not as a battle, but as an act of deliberate extermination. The fate of millions was written into the lines of maps, spread across tables in Hitler's headquarters. Strategy and ideology fused into a single deadly vision. The Soviet leadership, though battered, understood the stakes with equal clarity. Stalin, who had initially underestimated the scale of Barbarossa, now saw that Leningrad's fall would be catastrophic. The city's factories, population, and symbolic weight were irreplaceable assets to the Soviet war effort. Orders were issued to fortify every approach, to hold the line no matter the cost, and to transform the city into a fortress. Civilians were pressed into labor, digging anti-tank ditches, constructing wooden obstacles, and laying barbed wire across parks and boulevards. Women and children joined men in these efforts, transforming Leningrad into a city of soldiers. The Red Army, though bloodied, was reorganized under new commanders, determined to slow the German tide. Supplies were stockpiled, though never enough to sustain what was coming. Stalin made it clear surrender was unthinkable, and retreat would be punished as treason. For the people of Leningrad, this meant that their fate was tied not only to German plans, but to Stalin's unyielding will. The stage was set for a siege that would test human endurance, as no city had ever endured before. By late summer 1941, The momentum of Barbarossa had carried Army Group North to the very approaches of Leningrad. The city could already hear the distant thunder of artillery, feel the tremors of bombs falling on its outskirts, and see the smoke of burning villages on the horizon. German troops stood at the gates of history, poised to strangle one of the world's great cities. Yet what awaited them was not the quick collapse they had envisioned, but a struggle of endurance that would last 872 days. The Siege of Leningrad was about to begin, a battle not merely of armies but of entire populations. It would be fought with guns and bombs, but also with bread, hunger, and willpower. The road to Leningrad had been paved with conquest, but the city itself would become a crucible that defied the logic of blitzkrieg. As the encirclement closed, the world would soon witness a story of unimaginable suffering and unbreakable resilience. Operation Barbarossa had reached the north, and with it, history had arrived at the gates of Leningrad. Founded by Peter the Great on marshland, where the Neva meets the Baltic, the city that Soviet citizens called Leningrad wore history on its facades and factories. Its baroque palaces and broad avenues sat alongside foundries, slipways, and rows of red brick workshops, creating a city that was at once museum and mill. By 1941, the metropolis was a dense organism of nearly 3 million people across city and suburbs, a population that supplied industry, manpower, and a stubborn civic pride rare in any modern metropolis. That population was also the city's vulnerability. Feeding, housing, and defending so many souls would soon prove a logistical puzzle of staggering proportions. The Neva sliced the city into islands and thoroughfares, and port basins on the Gulf of Finland made Leningrad one of the Soviet Union's chief maritime gateways. Beyond its promenades and palaces, the urban landscape contained an industrial lattice, heavy machine shops, textile mills, precision instrument makers that kept factories and arsenals running. Canals, railheads, and barge slips knitted the city into national transport chains, linking its shops to ores from the Urals and grain from the north. In short, Leningrad before the siege was a city of contradictions, sublime culture and brutal production, civic life and strategic dependency, beauty and the cold mechanics of war. That dual nature, museum and munitions plant, would determine how the city prepared for, and later endured the onslaught to come. Above all else, Leningrad was a place whose very identity made it impossible to surrender without paying a price far beyond its walls. At the industrial heart of the city stood heavy works whose names resonated across the Soviet economy. Chief among them, the Kirov plant, heir to the old Putilov works, which turned steel into the frames and components of heavy industry. Along the Neva, and out toward the suburbs, the Admiralty and Baltic shipyards stretched slipways and cranes, repairing hulls and building vessels that supplied the Baltic fleet. Izharsky and Nevsky machine builders produced turbines, boilers, and locomotive parts. Smaller workshops produced optics, radio apparatus, and the arcane components that modern armies required. Aircraft maintenance units and light aircraft factories kept reconnaissance and coastal defense planes serviceable for northern operations. The city's industrial workforce was technically skilled, organized into trusts and ministries that meshed factory output with state war plans. By 1941, many factories had already rehearsed wartime production shifts and blackout drills, and cadres were prepared for emergency relocation if railheads fell under threat. Yet the specialized tooling and massive machine frames meant that not every mill could be shipped east without catastrophic interruption to output. The interdependence of Leningrad's shops with national rail and river networks amplified the danger. A severed rail or a blocked waterway could cascade into production collapse far beyond the city limits. Thus, industry made Leningrad a prize whose capture or neutralization would reverberate through the Soviet war economy. Military planners on both sides read the city's factory map as a roadmap to victory or ruin. Leningrad's strategic meaning extended to the sea, for the city sheltered a core of the Soviet Baltic Fleet and the shipbuilding complex that sustained it. Destroyers, minesweepers, and auxiliary vessels relied on the docks and repair slips in the city's estuaries. Submarine pens and coastal batteries clustered where sailors and shipwrights worked in shifting tides of urgency. Naval aviation squadrons drew maintenance and support from the city's hangars and workshops, offering reconnaissance over the Gulf of Finland and limited strike options against enemy coastal forces. Control of Leningrad meant access to the Baltic approaches and a degree of leverage over shipping to and from the northern ports, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, whose wartime lifelines would one day be crucial. Conversely, the survival of the fleet depended on the shore. Coal, munitions, steel, and trained dockyard crews could not be improvised overnight. The Admiralty's dry docks could put a crippled hull back into the fight, and coastal artillery sighted on shorelines could contest an enemy attempting maritime landings. Naval planners therefore saw the city not simply as a base, but as an integrated node of maritime power and industrial resilience. This fusion of ship and shore made Leningrad far more than a symbolic target. It was in realist terms a pivot of northern defense, whose loss would unbalance Soviet control of the eastern Baltic. For that reason, the fate of the fleet and the fate of the city were inseparable in any strategic reckoning. Beneath the factories and the docks lay the arteries of supply, a spiderweb of rails, canals, and roads that carried coal, iron, food, and fuel into the city's hungry teeth. Major rail lines converged on Leningrad, connecting it to Moscow, the Urals, and the Kola Peninsula, while barges plied the Ladoga-Neva waterway to supplement rail freight with heavy consignments. Port facilities handled import and export traffic in peacetime and were essential to any wartime resupply effort, but the underlying infrastructure was vulnerable to a coordinated interdiction. Russia's roads were for the most part underdeveloped, and in wet seasons they turned into a quagmire that slowed military movement and complicated logistics for mechanized forces. Anticipating this, municipal planners and commissars stockpiled grain, coal, and munitions at depots, and they rehearsed emergency routes across Lake Ladoga. Evacuation plans for non-essential citizens and selected industrial equipment were written and in some cases enacted as the German advance accelerated in June 1941. Yet the sheer scale of the population and the volume of heavy machinery meant that comprehensive evacuation was impossible without destroying the city's industrial core. That interdependence, the factories that required supply to function and the population that required food to survive, created a single vulnerable equation. Control of transport could decide life or death for millions. Logisticians on both sides understood that war in the north would be fought not only with guns but with rails and river barges, and they planned accordingly. Beyond steel and coal, Leningrad carried extraordinary symbolic weight for the Soviet state, a fact that elevated its defense into an existential imperative. The city had been the cradle of the 1917 revolution, its docks and barracks the stage for the seizure of power that birthed the Soviet Union. That history imbued Leningrad with an almost sacred status in the communist imagination. Monuments, street names, and civic ritual kept Lenin's legacy in public view, making the city a living emblem of Bolshevik legitimacy. For Stalin and the Politburo, the loss of Leningrad would therefore be more than a strategic setback. It would be a psychological calamity that could ripple through the Soviet body politic. Propaganda organs stressed this connection, invoking the city's revolutionary past to galvanize resistance and frame defense as a continuation of historic duty. Cultural institutions, The Hermitage, the Academy of Sciences, conservatories and theatres were mobilized to sustain morale and to demonstrate that life and learning would not be extinguished even as sirens wailed. The regime's insistence on holding Leningrad at all costs reflected this dual calculus: preserve production and preserve the myth. For many citizens, the link between 1917 and 1941 supplied an iron moral backbone. Defense was not simply military necessity, but fidelity to a historical mission. That ideological overlay complicated tactical choices, because leaders had to consider not only how to defend a city, but how its defense or failure would be interpreted at home and abroad. The human architecture of Leningrad was as consequential as its factories. Professors, dock workers, students and artists formed a dense urban network that sustained daily life and could be mobilized in wartime. Universities and research institutes fed engineers and specialists into the industrial machine, while conservatories and theatres sustained a civic culture that prized art alongside production. The Mariinsky Theatre and the Leningrad Conservatory were not ornaments, they were civic engines that shaped identity and cohesion, resources that the regime would later leverage when morale frayed. Hospitals, clinics, and medical research institutes clustered across the city, offering a level of healthcare capacity that would be sorely tested once the siege began. Housing concentrated multi-generational families in communal apartment blocks, creating resilient support networks, but also concentrating need in the face of shortages. Trade unions and party cells formed the backbone of civil defense, organizing brigades to build fortifications, run mess halls, and staff emergency services. Mutual aid, a culture of neighborly solidarity in crowded courtyards and stairwells, would prove as important as state rations when supply chains failed. Yet that density also multiplied the city's consumption. Bread, coal, and medical supplies would have to be delivered in industrial quantities to sustain even basic life. In essence, Leningrad's social fabric gave it stamina and created its Achilles heel at the same time. People provided the labor to endure, but they also required the lifelines that a besieged city might lose. In the months before the front reached the city, Leningrad's municipal authorities and military engineers set about hardening the metropolis for war, converting boulevards into anti-tank lines, and erecting barbed wire entanglements along likely avenues of advance. Thousands of citizens were mobilized into construction brigades, men and women hauling sandbags, cutting timber, and sinking steel into the earth to form defenses that could blunt an armored thrust. Factories rehearsed 24-hour shifts under blackout conditions, converted production lines to munitions, and practiced rapid disassembly protocols should evacuation prove necessary. Anti-aircraft batteries were sited on roof lines and in parks. Coastal guns were emplaced to contest any attempt to approach by sea. Volunteer militia units, workers, students, and retired veterans were raised, issued basic weapons, and taught the rudiments of urban combat in ad hoc training cycles that mixed courage with inexperience. Medical corps expanded, hospitals stocked what supplies they could, and evacuation lists circulated for priority women, children, and technical specialists. The NKVD tightened security around key industrial cadres, anxious about sabotage or political unreliability as the front drew near. All these measures bought some time and resilience, but they could not erase the underlying reality: a vast city whose survival depended on supply lines that might be severed. Thus, the preparations of 1941 were both practical and symbolic, a city girding its loins against an onslaught while refusing the idea that it might be taken without a terrible fight. German planning viewed Leningrad through the twin lenses of strategy and symbolism, and in that dual view the city became an explicit target for neutralization. Army Group North's campaign map showed how rail hubs, coastal batteries and naval repair yards could be interdicted to isolate the city. Hitler's rhetoric added ideological urgency by demanding Leningrad's neutralization as a blow against Bolshevism. German air crews and reconnaissance units were tasked to find and destroy rail junctions and supply depots. Panzer columns were ordered to envelop rather than to commit to prolonged urban assaults. In Berlin, the decision to starve a city to besiege it rather than to storm it was presented as both efficient and ruthless, a measure of attrition aimed more at civilians than at soldiers. Yet, even among Wehrmacht staff officers, practical doubts surfaced. A long siege of a city this size would tie down resources and might become a grinding enterprise rather than a decisive victory. Soviet planners read the threat with equal clarity and were forced into difficult trade-offs: how many factories to evacuate, how many people to move, and how much to hold in place to preserve the city's industrial capacity. The competing pressures, military, ideological, and humanitarian, created a set of choices whose consequences would be felt for years. And as summer faded into autumn in 1941, the stage was set. Leningrad, jewel and arsenal, symbol and city, stood at the center of a plan that would test the limits of endurance and the meaning of survival. By the late summer of 1941, the jaws of Operation Barbarossa were snapping shut across the north, and Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, pressed relentlessly toward its prize. German spearheads had slashed through the Baltic states in a matter of weeks, toppling governments and rolling across territories that only a year earlier had been annexed into the Soviet Union. Riga fell with startling speed, giving the Wehrmacht a critical port and forward base of supply for operations deeper into the Soviet Union. With panzer columns roaring down the highways, cities like Tallinn and Daugavpils became battlegrounds where Soviet defenders attempted desperate delaying actions. Each day, Soviet strongpoints crumbled before the combination of armored thrusts, Stuka dive bombers, and relentless infantry pressure. The Red Army fought stubbornly, but was poorly coordinated, its command networks shattered by the speed of German advance. Soviet units withdrew into the forests, conducting guerrilla-style ambushes, but unable to halt the main German push. German logistics struggled to keep pace, but the momentum of blitzkrieg carried formations steadily eastward toward the approaches of Leningrad. Every town captured tightened the cordon, every bridge seized brought the Wehrmacht closer to its ultimate goal. For the Soviets, the Baltic collapse was catastrophic. It meant the city of Lenin now stood almost naked before the invaders. South of the Gulf of Finland, the Finns seized their opportunity, aligning with Germany to reclaim territory lost in the Winter War of 1939-40. Finnish divisions advanced through Karelia, reoccupying Vyborg and pressing toward the Siva River, threatening Leningrad from the north. While Finnish leaders stopped short of storming the city itself, their presence on the Karelian Isthmus completed the northern arc of the encirclement. To the south, German Panzergruppe IV, commanded by General Erich Hoepner, spearheaded the drive east, bypassing strongpoints and cutting Soviet supply routes. Stuka bombers smashed rail junctions and bridges, isolating Leningrad from Moscow and other Soviet centers of gravity. Soviet High Command recognized the danger, ordering frantic reinforcements into the gap, but most were raw, undertrained militia brigades formed from factory workers and students. These hastily raised units, poorly equipped and scarcely drilled, stood against hardened Wehrmacht veterans armed with modern tanks and artillery. Yet their sacrifice slowed the German timetable, buying precious days for the construction of defensive lines around the city. By August, however, the noose was tightening, with German units poised on the Luga River line. It was no longer a question of whether Leningrad would be cut off, but how soon the circle would close. The battle for the Luga Line became one of the first desperate stands in the defense of Leningrad. Soviet engineers, workers and militia units threw up fortifications in swampy forests, digging trenches and laying minefields to slow the German approach. For weeks, savage fighting erupted across villages and riverbanks, as Soviet units clung stubbornly to their positions. German panzer divisions, accustomed to rapid breakthroughs, were forced into grinding assaults against stubborn defenders entrenched in dense woodland. Artillery duels thundered across the marshes while Soviet partisans struck from the forests, cutting supply convoys and ambushing stragglers. Despite their tenacity, Soviet losses mounted horrifically, with entire regiments wiped out in counterattacks that gained little ground. German engineers bridged rivers under fire, enabling panzers and mechanized infantry to renew their advance. Eventually, sheer weight of firepower and maneuver broke the Soviet line, forcing the defenders to fall back toward Leningrad itself. The fall of the Luga Line opened the road, leaving only thin layers of defenses between the Wehrmacht and its prize. Yet the delay had mattered. Every week gained allowed the Soviets to strengthen the defenses of their great city. The stage was now set for the tightening of the ring. By early September, German troops were closing in from three directions: northwest from the Baltic coast, south from Novgorod, and northeast from the approaches to Lake Ilmen. The capture of Schlisselburg, a fortress town at the southern tip of Lake Ladoga, was the critical blow that severed the last overland rail and road connection to the east. With Schlisselburg in German hands, the land corridor to the Soviet interior was gone, and Leningrad stood completely isolated. To the north, Finnish forces halted their advance short of the city's direct defenses, but their presence locked down the region, preventing Soviet relief. German artillery was now within range of the city's outer suburbs, and Luftwaffe squadrons pounded industrial plants and rail yards. The once bustling arteries of supply that connected Leningrad to the Soviet heartland were now reduced to rubble or cut entirely. Soviet citizens could see smoke rising on the horizon, evidence that their encirclement was nearly complete. The Wehrmacht had achieved one of the greatest operational feats of the early war, severing a metropolis of nearly 3 million from its nation. In Berlin, Hitler boasted that Leningrad was finished, ready to be starved into submission, yet the city refused to die. The encirclement was not merely geographic. It was a psychological weapon. German propaganda leaflets fell over Soviet lines, promising annihilation if resistance continued, while German broadcasts mocked the defenders. Yet far from breaking morale, the isolation hardened Soviet resolve. Stalin declared Leningrad a fortress city to be held at all costs, and ordered that no surrender would ever be contemplated. NKVD units enforced discipline with brutal efficiency, ensuring no wavering among the ranks. Civilians joined militias, dug trenches, and constructed barricades along boulevards, determined to fight street by street if necessary. The party organized cultural events and broadcasts to project defiance, even as bombs fell from the sky. For German troops, the encirclement meant a new form of warfare, siege rather than blitzkrieg, requiring patience and supply lines of their own. For Soviet citizens, it marked the beginning of one of the longest and most harrowing ordeals in modern history. What had begun as a rapid advance now became a test of endurance, a grinding contest of starvation, fortitude, and sheer human will. The Luftwaffe played a critical role in sealing the city's fate, launching waves of air raids against Leningrad's rail yards, factories, and food warehouses. On September 8th, German bombers struck the Badayev warehouses, where vast reserves of food for the city were stored. The resulting inferno consumed thousands of tons of flour, sugar, and other essentials, losses that would prove catastrophic in the months to come. Fire brigades fought heroically to save what they could, but much of the stockpile was reduced to ash and twisted ruins. German air supremacy at this stage allowed them to raid at will, striking both military and civilian targets with devastating effect. Anti-aircraft batteries fought back, downing some aircraft, but the damage had been done. The psychological shock of seeing the city's food reserves destroyed was immense, convincing many that starvation was now inevitable. Yet rather than collapse, the people of Leningrad responded with grim determination, vowing to resist even in the face of hunger. The destruction of the warehouses symbolized the new phase of the war, not one of quick victories, but of attrition and suffering. From this point onward, the siege became a battle of supply lines and survival. On the German side, the encirclement demanded massive resources to maintain. Army Group North had to hold a broad ring around the city, extending from the Gulf of Finland to the shores of Lake Ladoga. This required garrisons, artillery placements, and continuous resupply across long, vulnerable lines. Soviet counterattacks, though costly and often futile, forced the Germans to commit additional divisions to guard against breakout attempts. Partisan activity in the forests behind the front further complicated logistics, harassing convoys and cutting communications. German commanders understood that a direct assault into the city would be devastatingly costly in men and material, recalling the urban carnage of World War I. Hitler himself decreed that Leningrad was not to be stormed but strangled, left to starve until surrender came by default. Orders specified that the population was not to be fed or evacuated. Leningrad was to be erased as a city, its people reduced to nothing more than casualties of policy. It was a chilling strategy, one that redefined the campaign as both military operation and war crime. Thus, the German encirclement became not only a military fact, but a deliberate act of calculated annihilation. For the Soviet leadership, the closing of the ring forced immediate, desperate improvisation. With all land routes cut, the only lifeline remaining was Lake Ladoga, a vast body of water stretching to the east of the city. Barges, fishing boats, and whatever vessels could be mustered began ferrying supplies across the lake under constant German air and artillery attack. This tenuous connection, later dubbed the Road of Life, would become the city's sole artery of survival. Engineers and civilians alike worked feverishly to expand docks, unload cargo, and stockpile supplies that trickled in. At the same time, plans for winter convoys across the frozen surface of the lake were drawn up, though the dangers were immense. The survival of millions now hinged on this fragile lifeline, one that could be severed at any moment by enemy action. Yet despite shortages, despite the chaos of bombardments, the system began to function. The city would not be abandoned. The encirclement was complete, but the story of endurance was only beginning. By September 1941, the Siege of Leningrad had begun in earnest, and the world was watching. German commanders believed the city would collapse within weeks, succumbing to starvation and despair. Soviet leaders braced for an ordeal that could last months, though few anticipated it would stretch to nearly 900 days. Civilians who had once walked proud avenues and attended symphonies now faced the stark reality of siege warfare. The fate of a metropolis, its people, its culture, its industry, now rested on fragile supply lines and human resilience. Leningrad had been cut off, but it had not been conquered. And as autumn deepened into winter, the city prepared to endure one of the darkest and most extraordinary chapters in the history of warfare. The encirclement was both an end and a beginning, the closing of the ring that marked the start of survival against impossible odds. When the ring around Leningrad began to tighten in late August and September 1941, Joseph Stalin issued an uncompromising order that would shape the city's fate. Leningrad was to be held at all costs. From Moscow, directives flowed to the local party apparatus and to the Red Army, demanding that no voluntary evacuation or surrender would be allowed, and that every resource be mobilized to keep the city in Soviet hands. This was not merely a military command, but a political imperative. Stalin understood that losing the cradle of the revolution would collapse morale and imperil the legitimacy of Soviet rule across millions of square kilometers. In response, the Leningrad defense structure was hastily reorganized into a wartime apparatus, combining the Leningrad Front's military command, the Baltic Fleet's naval power, and the city's civilian leadership into a single command, directed at survival. Barricades, anti-tank ditches, and fortified lines were prioritized, and wartime councils were established to coordinate logistics, munitions, and civil defense under the watchful eye of the party. The political leadership made clear that failure would be treated as treason, and orders were sent to the NKVD to assist in maintaining discipline and rooting out defeatism among soldiers and civilians alike. From the very outset, the defense of Leningrad was therefore as much about politics and obedience as it was about trenches and gun emplacements, binding the city's survival to the state's authority. Soviet planners funneled scarce reserves of artillery, anti-tank weapons, and engineers into the area, prioritizing the creation of stop lines on rivers and ridges that could blunt German armor. At the same time, propaganda and cultural leaders were mobilized to bolster morale, with newspapers, radio, and local intelligentsia urged to frame endurance as both duty and historical mission. Stalin's order made holding the city a national command, and that imperative would color every decision made by military and civilian leaders in the months to come. One of the most visible consequences of the decree was the mass mobilization of civilian volunteers into the People's Militia, units drawn from factory brigades, tram drivers, students, and retired officers who had not meant to pick up arms. These hastily assembled forces numbered in the tens of thousands, pulled from every workshop and communal stairwell in Leningrad and armed with what could be found: Mosin-Nagant rifles, captured pistols, Maxim machine guns removed from warehouses, and improvised explosive devices. Training was rudimentary and often measured in hours rather than weeks, with ex-officers and NCOs teaching basic entrenchment, river defense, and urban fighting techniques amid the clang of factory shifts. Women took prominent roles, not only as medics and factory workers, but as combatants, serving as machine gunners, anti-aircraft crews, and in some grim cases, frontline snipers. Students converted lecture halls into rifle ranges, and collective farm brigades brought in knowledge of winter survival that would prove invaluable when snow and ice arrived. Despite courage, these militia units suffered shortages of ammunition, winter clothing, and coherent command, making their early engagements especially bloody against Wehrmacht veterans backed by tanks and close air support. Yet their presence was decisive in the psychological battle, seeing workers, teachers, and clerks in uniform bolstered civilian determination and complicated German calculations about the cost of urban assault. Local party committees organized food distribution points and casualty evacuation, often under fire, while labor battalions constructed anti-tank obstacles through parks and along key avenues. The city's electrical, water, and tram workers kept critical services running as long as possible, their labor forming the mundane backbone of any defensive system amid chaos. In the first weeks of the siege, these improvised defenders bought vital time, blunting initial Wehrmacht thrusts and giving the Red Army and naval units space to reorganize. The weapons and material that filtered into Leningrad formed a patchwork of pre-war inventories, hastily delivered reserves, and improvised arms jury-rigged in the city's workshops. Divisional 76.2 mm field guns and 45 mm anti-tank pieces formed the core of mobile firepower, with older models pressed into both coastal defense and anti-armor roles as necessity demanded. Light tanks such as the BT series and obsolete T-26 appeared where available, but their thin armor and mechanical unreliability limited their effectiveness against German Panzer III and IV formations on open ground. Machine gun nests, built around Maxims and DP-27 weapons, anchored defensive positions, while mortars, 50 mm and 82 mm, proved invaluable in the close-quarter fighting of streets and courtyards. Engineers stockpiled sapper charges, hand grenades, and bottles of flammable mix to transform narrow lanes and stairwells into killing traps for any armored vehicle or assault team attempting a breach. Rail-mounted guns and coastal batteries provided longer-range firepower, with heavy calibers sighted to engage concentrations well beyond the city's immediate outskirts. A lack of modern anti-aircraft systems gave the Luftwaffe near free rein early in the siege, though dedicated AA crews improvised with heavy machine guns mounted on rooftops and church towers. Weapons repair workshops, often operating in basements and converted museums, became lifelines, machining spare parts and salvaging barrels to keep guns firing well beyond typical service lives. Ammunition shortages were a constant strategic constraint. Commanders rationed shells and bullets carefully, prioritizing coastal and anti-tank guns while relying on sabotage and partisan raids to supplement stocks. The technological patchwork of Leningrad's armaments reflected the broader theme of the siege: resilience forged from improvisation, where ingenuity sometimes compensated for industrial disparity. The Baltic fleet anchored in Leningrad's harbors emerged as a decisive element in the city's defense, its warships and shore batteries projecting firepower onto the surrounding plains and approaches. Battleships and cruisers could not freely maneuver in the shallow gulfs, but destroyers, gunboats, and coastal artillery installations provided crucial support that complemented land batteries. Naval guns of large caliber dug into German concentrations and interdicted supply routes, their plunging fire disrupting enemy formations and complicating axes of advance. The fleet also undertook the grim duty of evacuating civilians from threatened suburbs, organizing convoys across the Neva and toward the relative safety of Lake Ladoga in the early days before overland routes were severed. Naval engineers adapted merchant vessels into troop transports and improvised hospital barges, and shipwrights performed emergency repairs to keep those lifelines functional under bombardment. As the siege tightened, the fleet's anti-aircraft batteries and barrage balloons helped blunt Luftwaffe raids aimed at finishing the city from the skies. Coordination between army artillery and naval fire required meticulous timing. Forward observers on rooftops and shorelines relayed targets for concentrated barrages that stopped German assaults in their tracks. The fleet's presence also complicated German plans for a direct assault. Any attempt to cross open water or assault southern approaches risked naval interdiction and amphibious countermeasures. Yet the fleet itself suffered rising shortages: fuel for boilers, shells for guns and spare parts for engines, and increasingly had to conserve its power for the most critical moments. Even so, sailors and shipwrights remained a psychological and practical bulwark, buying the city time and projecting a stubborn maritime defiance central to Leningrad's defense narrative. Political officers and security organs intensified their presence across the city, embedding commissars within units to monitor morale and enforce the Kremlin's line that retreat or capitulation would be met with the harshest consequences. These commissars, often with scant combat experience, but extensive political authority, had the power to countermand orders, issue public exhortations, and coordinate with NKVD detachments when discipline broke down. The NKVD repurposed some of its forces as barrier troops and internal security units, securing critical installations, guarding supply depots, and arresting those suspected of hoarding, profiteering, or plotting to flee. Courts-martial and summary punishments were used against officers and civilians deemed to have failed in duty, a brutal calculus that reflected the regime's conviction that political cohesion was a force multiplier in wartime. At the same time, commissars organized propaganda brigades that produced newspapers, leaflets, and radio programs aimed at sustaining worker morale and commemorating acts of heroism to counterbalance grim realities. Political officers also facilitated distribution of scarce rations to priority workers and military units, using party channels to ensure munitions and food reached critical points of defense. The interlacing of political oversight with military command created tensions. Commanders resented ideological interference, while commissars insisted that victory required political as well as military discipline. In practice, many officers and party officials learned to cooperate, blending tactical decisions with morale management to keep units functioning under fire. The dual system could be chaotic, but it also meant that when an officer faltered, a political structure remained to rally defenders and maintain cohesion. Ultimately, the political will enforced by commissars and the NKVD transformed Leningrad's defense into a collective enterprise where survival depended on obedience as much as on bullets. From the beginning, the civilian economy was militarized. Children, teachers, bakers, and engineers were pressed into service to build defenses, keep factories running, and sustain the fragile infrastructure that supported life. Evacuation trains rolled eastward carrying hundreds of thousands, children, cultural treasures, and some factory equipment, while those left behind kept electrical plants lit, water pumps turning, and bread ovens burning despite shelling and shortages. Many heavy workshops could not be moved, and thousands of skilled workers remained to repair and convert machinery for wartime needs, welding armor plates, turning shells, and improvising replacements for scarce parts. Women became critical both on production lines and in auxiliary military roles, staffing hospitals, driving ambulances, operating searchlights, and manufacturing cartridges into the night. Municipal kitchens and bakeries became literal lifelines, compressing rations to the barest caloric minimum while managing to produce bread that was sometimes hollowed out with sawdust to stretch supplies. Rail evacuation was perilous, trains were bombed and derailed, and many refugees endured freezing nights in open wagons while crews labored towards safe hinterlands. Cultural institutions coordinated with state ministries to move paintings, archives, and instruments east, a mass migration of memory that saved priceless heritage from destruction. The human drama of evacuation produced wrenching separations and a diaspora of children and elders that would influence post-war demographics for decades. Still, the evacuation and relocation effort, imperfect as it was, preserved a cadre of industry and expertise that would prove indispensable both for defense and for post-war reconstruction. Engineers and citizen brigades reshaped the city's streets into a defensive landscape, cutting anti-tank ditches across avenues, filling parks with earthen berms, and embedding dragon's teeth and steel ramparts in likely avenues of approach. Tramlines were ripped up to create rubble fields and obstacles, and bridges spanning the Neva were mined and prepared for demolition to deny German crossings and funnel armored units into prepared kill zones. Sappers dug networks of tunnels and communication trenches, linking apartment blocks so defenders could move under bombardment, and palace gardens and public monuments were cannibalized for stone and timber to reinforce parapets. Rail bridges and junctions were fortified with sandbags and emplacements for machine guns, turning transport infrastructure into choke points defenders could hold with relatively small forces. Artillery positions were emplaced on high ground and in casemates carved into quays and riverbanks, giving plunging fire against any enemy formations that tried to mass for an advance. Anti-tank guns were concealed in cellars and courtyards, waiting to ambush panzers that attempted to use the city's broad avenues as avenues of advance. Public shelters and basement hospitals were stocked with what supplies could be gathered, and volunteers organized stretcher teams that would ferry the wounded through rubble and blast. These measures did not create an impenetrable fortress, but they turned the metropolis into a grinding obstacle, forcing the attacker to pay in time and blood for every yard of gain. In the early autumn of 1941, they helped blunt initial thrusts and set the conditions for a siege whose brutality would be measured not just in artillery, but in the slow arithmetic of hunger. Amid the political directives, military orders, and engineering feats, human stories threaded through every street and courtyard, reminding the city that defense was lived at the granular level of daily sacrifice. A tram driver welded scrap into a tank trap under a street lamp. A schoolteacher organized a night kitchen that fed 100 workers, and old shipwrights turned their hands to fabricating rail barricades by lamplight. Neighbors shared bread rations, and communal stairwells became ad hoc barracks where watch rotations mixed with whispered remembrances of pre-war life and with furtive plans for survival. Volunteer medics stitched shrapnel wounds on kitchen tables, and young recruits learned in hours what peacetime training would have taken months to teach. Political officers paced the lines, reading bulletins and poetry, exhorting fighters by connecting their sacrifice to the revolution and to the future of the Soviet Union. As winter approached, shelters filled with those who had nowhere else to go, their faces fixed with the grim logic of endurance, hold the city, and perhaps live to see liberation. The intertwining of military command, naval support, civilian labor, and ideological enforcement produced an ecosystem of defense that would define Leningrad's long ordeal. Stalin's order had not removed the hardships, but it injected into the city's veins a stubborn determination to resist at any cost, a determination born as much of fear as of courage. The men and women who took up arms or built barricades did so knowing that their choices would echo for generations. They were not merely defending territory, but defending a symbol and a way of life. With the ring closed and winter approaching, Leningrad moved into a phase where survival, supply and spirit would be tested in a crucible unlike any other in modern warfare. When the German encirclement threatened to snap shut around Leningrad in the late summer of 1941, the city's answer was not only the Red Army, but the people themselves, called to arms in the form of the Narodno Opuchenie, the People's Militia. From the factories of the Kirov Works to the lecture halls of Leningrad University, citizens exchanged hammers and books for rifles and shovels. These men and women, many with no prior military training, were mobilized in their tens of thousands by party decree, organized into divisions that bore the names of their factories, neighborhoods, and institutions. They gathered in courtyards and workshops to receive worn rifles, antiquated bayonets, or even hunting shotguns pressed into service as weapons of war. For many, training consisted of little more than learning how to fire a bolt-action rifle, dig a trench, and follow basic commands shouted by officers with barely more experience than themselves. Students carried notebooks one week and hand grenades the next, their education interrupted by the harsh lesson of survival at the front. Workers marched to the defense lines in their overalls, often still smelling of oil and soot from their shifts. What bound them together was not military discipline, but a shared conviction that their city, Lenin's city, must not fall. In their eyes, to fight was to live, and to retreat was to forfeit everything. The militia represented both desperation and defiance, a living testament to the Soviet belief that every citizen was a soldier in the war for survival. The numbers themselves were staggering. By September 1941, over 300,000 civilians had been mobilized into militia divisions in and around Leningrad. Entire factories emptied, their machinery still running as men and women filed into hastily assembled battalions. University professors marched shoulder to shoulder with their students, while shopkeepers and tram drivers stood in ranks beside sailors and dock workers. Divisions such as the 2nd and 3rd Leningrad People's Militia became known by the districts from which they came, carrying the pride of their neighborhoods into battle. Many had no uniforms beyond armbands or cloth insignia, hastily sewn to jackets, and boots were in such short supply that some militia fighters went to war in their work shoes. Armament was equally uneven. Some received modern rifles, others antiquated models from Tsarist stockpiles, while still others were handed only grenades or instructed to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Despite the shortcomings, morale on the day of their mobilization was fierce, with parades, speeches, and bands sending the new soldiers to the front under banners proclaiming loyalty to the motherland. Few of them realized just how cruel the front would be, or how brief their service might last. For many, the journey out of the city would be their last, the sound of marching songs soon drowned by the thunder of German artillery. The front line to which these militia units were dispatched was brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. Positions along the Luga and Neva rivers, hastily fortified by engineers, became killing grounds where German artillery and air power shredded inadequately trained civilians. At Krasnoye Selo and MGA, militia divisions dug into muddy earthworks, only to be torn apart by concentrated Stuka attacks that their limited anti-aircraft weapons could not counter. Militiamen who had fired their first bullets on practice ranges days earlier now faced seasoned panzer grenadiers advancing with precision and deadly firepower. The reality of war hit with savage suddenness. Friends fell in the mud, communications broke down, and units melted under the pressure of combined arms assaults. Even so, small groups held out with astonishing bravery, delaying German columns for hours or days in battles that official histories would later mark as heroic sacrifices. The militia lacked artillery support, and often had only limited access to rations, their supply trains overwhelmed or destroyed by Luftwaffe raids. Yet they fought on, driven not by training or doctrine, but by an instinctive refusal to let the enemy pass. In many sectors, these untrained civilians were the only obstacle between Leningrad and the Wehrmacht. Their sacrifice would cost them dearly, but without their blood, the city might have fallen in those first desperate weeks. The composition of the militia divisions told the story of Leningrad's society at war. There were teenagers barely out of school, elderly men too old for conscription, and women who volunteered in roles ranging from nurses to frontline machine gunners. Workers from the Kirov plant manned heavy machine guns forged in their own workshops, while students from the Polytechnic Institute served as artillery spotters despite their limited experience. Many were motivated not only by patriotism, but by personal attachment. The neighborhoods they defended were the very streets where their families lived. Commissars circulated among the ranks, reminding them of Stalin's order that no retreat would be tolerated, but the truth was most needed no reminders. They understood that there was nowhere left to run. The city's children often followed their fathers to the mustering points, pressing flowers or bread into their hands before watching them disappear into the haze of war. These emotional scenes played out across courtyards and tram stops, binding the civilian population to the fate of their militia. The transformation of ordinary citizens into soldiers reshaped the very identity of the city. Leningrad was no longer just defended by the Red Army, it was defended by itself. Losses among the people's militia were catastrophic. At the Nevsky Piatashok bridgehead, militia battalions suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% within days of combat. At the MGA sector, entire companies were annihilated in desperate counterattacks against entrenched German positions. Poorly trained to maneuver under fire, militia fighters often charged across open ground into withering machine gun and mortar fire, leaving fields littered with bodies. Survivors told of units reduced to a handful of men, crawling through mud and blood, trying to regroup as German tanks advanced. Commanders faced impossible choices: order their civilian fighters into hopeless assaults, or risk being accused of cowardice and treason by political overseers. In this crucible, many chose to fight on until nothing remained of their formations. German reports noted the stubbornness of these amateur soldiers, surprised at their willingness to die in place rather than surrender. Yet for all their courage, the toll was devastating. Tens of thousands perished within weeks, erasing entire divisions from the Soviet order of battle. Their sacrifice, however, delayed German breakthroughs, buying time for regular Red Army units and engineers to strengthen the defenses around the city itself. In their deaths, they achieved what they could not with training or weapons. They saved Leningrad by forcing the Wehrmacht to bleed precious time. The tragedy of the People's Militia extended beyond the battlefield to the homes and families they left behind. Mothers received no formal notification when sons failed to return, only silence punctuated by rumors and whispered accounts from survivors. Wives and children waited in vain at tram stops or factories, their loved ones never to come back. In communal apartments, empty bunks and silent dinner tables bore witness to the cost of defending the city. The city's official newspapers glorified the heroism of the militia, but rarely acknowledged the true scale of the losses. Instead, their memory was woven into the mythology of the city's resistance, their sacrifice framed as necessary for survival. In truth, their deaths left a void in Leningrad's workforce and community life that would exacerbate the suffering during the long siege ahead. Yet families clung to the belief that their sacrifice had meaning, that their sons and daughters had not died in vain, but had joined a pantheon of heroes defending Lenin's city. This narrative sustained many through the hunger and cold that were still to come. Despite the horrific casualties, the People's Militia left an indelible mark on the course of the siege. Their presence forced the Germans to divert resources, slowed advances, and transformed what might have been a rapid assault into a grinding struggle. The militia's resistance allowed the Red Army to reorganize battered divisions, fortify key positions, and integrate reinforcements brought across Lake Ladoga. More importantly, their sacrifice gave the civilian population a sense of ownership in the defense of the city, blurring the line between soldier and citizen. Leningrad became a fortress not only in concrete and steel, but in spirit, its defenders drawn from every walk of life. Even in their annihilation, the militia demonstrated to the world that this was not a city that would surrender easily. They became symbols of defiance, their stories retold in propaganda and whispered across frozen courtyards to sustain morale. Their deaths were terrible, but their example was enduring. By the time the front stabilized, what remained of the People's Militia had been folded into regular Red Army units, their divisions shattered, but their legacy cemented. Survivors carried with them the scars of impossible battles, their comrades buried in shallow graves, or left unmarked in forests and fields. The militia experiment had been tragic in outcome, but essential in effect. Without their sacrifice, the defense of Leningrad might not have survived those first crucial months. Stalin's order of no surrender had been made flesh by the city's citizens, who transformed themselves into soldiers, even when fate gave them no chance of survival. Their legacy would echo throughout the siege, a reminder that Leningrad's endurance was purchased not only by armies, but by its people. As the long winter set in and hunger began to grip the city, the memory of their stand became one of the few sources of strength left to those who endured. In death, the people's militia had given their city time, and in war, time was life. By September 1941, as the encirclement of Leningrad tightened, the German army shifted from rapid assault to systematic bombardment, and the city entered a new phase of horror. Heavy artillery batteries positioned on the southern approaches and along the shores of Lake Ladoga began shelling industrial districts, railway stations, and residential neighborhoods with mechanical precision. Each day, citizens listened to the mournful whine of incoming shells and the crack of detonations that shattered windows and reduced apartment blocks to rubble. The Luftwaffe compounded the terror with bombing raids that targeted factories, shipyards, and most disastrously, food warehouses. On September 8th, German bombers ignited the Barbarossa warehouses, destroying much of the city's grain and sugar reserves in a single firestorm. Witnesses described flames leaping into the sky as desperate citizens tried to salvage smoldering sacks of flour from the inferno. What might have sustained the city through weeks of hardship vanished in hours, leaving officials scrambling to calculate how long meager rations could last. From that day forward, hunger became as much a weapon as artillery, and the people of Leningrad began to reckon with the grim truth that starvation would be their greatest enemy. As autumn deepened, the Soviet authorities introduced rationing systems that quickly revealed the scale of the catastrophe. Workers in critical industries received 600 grams of bread a day, while dependents, children, and the unemployed were issued less than half that amount. Bread itself became a grim parody of nourishment, made not only from flour, but from sawdust, cellulose, and whatever fillers could be milled into edible form. Citizens queued in the cold for hours at bakeries, clutching ration cards, praying that supplies had not run out before their turn arrived. Mothers cut thin slices of bread into smaller pieces to make meals last longer, while children learned to scrape soup bowls clean of every drop. By late October, malnutrition was visible on the streets, sunken eyes, gaunt faces, and shuffling steps of people weakened by hunger. The city's hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from dystrophy, scurvy, and exhaustion, yet medical supplies were as scarce as food. The ration system created a brutal hierarchy of survival, where those employed in war industries stood a better chance than clerks, pensioners, or the unemployed. For many, each day's ration determined whether they would live to see the next sunrise. The German bombardments and air raids intensified the misery, striking not only military targets, but deliberately aimed at civilian morale. Shells rained down on residential quarters, tearing apart trams, schools, and apartment courtyards, where families huddled in fear. Bomb fragments riddled hospital wards and cut down lines of citizens waiting for bread. The Luftwaffe returned again and again, ignoring anti-aircraft fire that was too thin to challenge their dominance. Air raid sirens became a constant background noise, forcing citizens into makeshift shelters in basements and metro stations. In these subterranean spaces, thousands crammed together, enduring nights of cold, dust, and fear, while listening to the distant thud of explosions. Families carried icons, photographs, or books into the shelters, clinging to fragments of normal life in the midst of chaos. When they emerged, they often found their homes destroyed, their possessions reduced to ash. Yet, in spite of the relentless shelling, there was no exodus, no surrender. The population clung to their city with a grim, stubborn defiance. For them, every hour survived was a victory, even if victory tasted of hunger and smoke. As food vanished, citizens turned to desperate measures, transforming the city into a place of improvised survival. Pets disappeared from courtyards, their absence noted in whispers as families resorted to eating whatever flesh they could find. Glue boiled from wallpaper became broth. Leather belts and shoes were softened and chewed for sustenance. Grass, bark, and weeds were gathered from parks, once meant for leisure, turned into thin stews that provided little nourishment but staved off starvation. Children scoured streets for crumbs or scraps of grain spilled from rail wagons destroyed in air raids. Corpses uncollected in the snow sometimes froze with bread crusts, still clutched in skeletal fingers, silent testimony to the city's hunger. Yet even in this despair, there were moments of resilience. Communal kitchens ladled out watery soup, neighbors shared meager rations with the elderly, and cultural institutions staged concerts to remind citizens that life had meaning beyond survival. The most famous of these acts, the Leningrad Symphony performed amid bombardments, was still months away, but seeds of cultural defiance were already being planted. Against hunger and fear, the spirit of the city fought back in whatever ways it could. The Red Army units defending the perimeter shared the city's hardships, but bore the additional burden of constant combat. Soldiers fought from trenches dug into frozen earth, their greatcoats thin against the creeping cold, their rations scarcely more substantial than those of the civilians they protected. German artillery systematically targeted supply depots, making the delivery of ammunition and food to the front perilous and erratic. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion among exhausted units, bolstered by reinforcements often drawn straight from the city's workers and students. The People's Militia, already decimated, melted into regular army formations, where their survivors fought with grim determination despite malnourishment and disease. Communication lines frayed under constant shelling, forcing couriers to brave shellfire and snowstorms to carry messages between sectors. Soviet artillery, though limited, struck back at German positions with dogged persistence, using every shell as if it were gold. For the soldiers, the siege was a paradox, cut off from their nation, yet entrusted with its defense, starving but expected to embody resilience. Their example, often hidden in the trenches, fed the city's will to endure even as supplies dwindled. The approach of winter transformed hardship into catastrophe. As early frosts blanketed the city, heating fuel vanished, and apartment blocks grew colder with each passing night. Families huddled together in one room, burning furniture, books, and even flooring to keep a flicker of warmth alive. Water pumps froze, forcing citizens to break ice on the Neva or canals and haul buckets through snow-covered streets. Corpses began to pile up, their removal impossible in the face of dwindling manpower and fuel. By November, daily temperatures plunged well below freezing, and starvation combined with exposure to reap thousands of lives each week. The cemeteries overflowed and mass graves became the only practical means of burial. In stairwells and courtyards, bodies lay frozen where they had fallen, grim markers of the siege's toll. Yet in the midst of this suffering, civic order did not collapse entirely. Ration cards continued to be stamped. Bakeries opened under bombardment, and workers reported to factories that still managed to turn out shells and spare parts. The city's very routines became a form of defiance, a refusal to let death dictate existence. German strategy was clear. Leningrad was to be starved into submission, not stormed in costly urban combat. Hitler decreed that the city should not be taken but obliterated by hunger, its population annihilated without mercy. Orders circulated, forbidding the acceptance of surrender. The city was to be erased from the map and handed over to Finland for eventual resettlement. German propaganda proclaimed that the Soviet duel was doomed, yet weeks passed, then months, and still the city endured. For the Wehrmacht, the siege tied down divisions and consumed artillery shells, but the hope of a quick collapse kept them committed. For the Soviets, every day Leningrad resisted became a victory of its own, a symbol to the wider world that Hitler's armies were not unstoppable. The city's defiance carried political significance far beyond its walls, bolstering Soviet morale nationwide and signaling to allies that the USSR would not be broken easily. Leningrad had become a fortress not only of stone and steel, but of endurance and willpower. By the end of 1941, the city stood on the brink of one of the longest and most terrible sieges in modern history, a crucible of suffering that would stretch for nearly 900 days. Hunger stalked every household. Shells fell with numbing regularity, and winter winds howled through shattered windows and broken doors. Yet the city still lived, factories still clanged, trams still rattled along frozen tracks, and children still recited lessons in bomb-damaged schools. Leningrad had been cut off, brutalized and starved, but it had not surrendered, and in its endurance lay the seed of eventual triumph. The first winter had only just begun, and the horrors ahead would eclipse even these opening months. Still, in the face of annihilation, the people braced themselves, determined that their city would not be erased from history. The siege had become more than a military campaign. It was a struggle for the soul of a nation. By the late autumn of 1941, hunger had become the most insidious enemy within Leningrad's walls, striking deeper than artillery and more relentlessly than bombs. Ration levels, already meager, were reduced to quantities that barely sustained life, with workers in war industries surviving on just 250 grams of bread a day. For clerks, children, and the unemployed, the ration fell to an unthinkable 125 grams, a portion smaller than a slice of bread in peacetime. Worse still, the bread itself bore little resemblance to food, made of ground cellulose, sawdust, and bran, mixed with what flour could be found. Citizens joked grimly that they were eating wood, but the joke quickly lost its edge as bodies weakened and lives slipped away. In kitchens across the city, families stared at a single loaf as though it were treasure, rationing every crumb as if it could hold back death. The German plan was working. Starvation was being wielded as a weapon as destructive as any shell. In the silence of darkened apartments, hunger gnawed without cease, a constant reminder of how precarious existence had become. The effects of malnutrition were visible everywhere, transforming Leningrad into a city of hollow-eyed shadows. Once bustling workers shuffled through streets with slow, halting steps, their faces grey and skeletal, their clothes hanging loose on emaciated frames. Children collapsed in schoolrooms, unable to remain conscious through their lessons, while teachers struggled to lift spirits despite their own exhaustion. Tramcars often ground to a halt as drivers fainted at the controls, their bodies too weak to manage the levers. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from dystrophy, a wasting illness born of prolonged starvation, and doctors fought a losing battle with limited supplies and no medicines. Scurvy gnawed at gums, tuberculosis spread unchecked, and simple infections claimed lives by the thousands. Exhaustion blurred the line between work and collapse, as men and women reported to factories, only to slump over their machines within hours. The city's productivity faltered, not from lack of will, but because human bodies were breaking under deprivation. In every corner of Leningrad, hunger left its mark in sunken cheeks, shuffling steps, and silent despair. Yet even in such conditions, the system of ration cards and queues continued, as though order itself could defy starvation. Citizens clutched their cards like passports to survival, lining up before dawn in the cold, hoping against hope that bread remained when their turn came. Queues stretched for blocks, sometimes ending in bitter disappointment when bakery shelves were bare. Parents gave their portions to children, choosing to starve silently so their sons and daughters might live another day. In the black markets that sprouted in alleys, flour and butter fetched impossible prices, accessible only to those with wealth or influence. Rumors spread of party officials hoarding supplies, stoking resentment among the desperate, yet the vast majority of citizens, had only their ration bread. To many, a single crust became the measure of life, a scrap of hope clutched against the inevitability of death. In the harsh arithmetic of survival, every bite mattered, and the city endured day by day, loaf by loaf. The winter cold compounded the misery, making hunger all the more unbearable. With no fuel, homes were unheated, and families huddled in blankets, conserving energy as their bodies consumed themselves. The snow-covered streets became littered with corpses, many frozen in poses that revealed their final struggle for sustenance. People died while waiting in breadlines, their ration cards still in stiffened hands, testifying to a death inches away from salvation. Children carried buckets of water from frozen rivers, collapsing halfway, too weak to finish the journey. Dogs and cats disappeared from the streets, their absence a grim indicator of desperation. Even rats grew scarce as humans competed with vermin for crumbs of food. The hunger was universal, yet it stripped away individuality, reducing lives to a common battle for survival. The city's rhythm became measured, not in days but in meals, or the absence of them. And still, despite the death that surrounded them, citizens carried on, clinging to routine as if normality could keep starvation at bay. Despair, however, created a darker undercurrent that officials never spoke of openly: the rise of cannibalism. As bodies piled up in stairwells and morgues overflowed, rumors whispered of neighbors who had resorted to the unthinkable. The NKVD began to record cases, documenting arrests for both grave robbing and the killing of children for food. Families, weakened and desperate, guarded their young as much from hunger-maddened neighbors as from the bombs falling overhead. Public warnings were issued in posters, bluntly declaring, "Do not resort to cannibalism. It is a crime against the motherland." Yet such crimes, though unspoken in official histories, became a reality in a city pushed beyond the limits of endurance. For many, the horror was not only in the act itself, but in the knowledge that it was conceivable, that hunger had stripped away humanity's final barriers. It was a testament to how complete the German plan of starvation had been, and to how deep the suffering in Leningrad truly ran. And yet, in the midst of this abyss, sparks of resilience persisted, defying the German weapon of hunger. Musicians continued to play in concert halls, even when fainting from weakness, their performances reminding audiences that beauty could still exist. Teachers still lectured in classrooms, their voices hoarse, their students too tired to listen, but the very act of teaching became an act of defiance. Factories, battered and freezing, still produced shells and rifles, their workers collapsing over assembly lines, only to be lifted back up by comrades. Families shared scraps of food with neighbors, a gesture of solidarity that seemed irrational in a world of hunger, but preserved the humanity that starvation sought to destroy. These small acts mattered as much as victories on the battlefield, for they declared that Leningrad would not be broken by hunger alone. Even as bodies thinned and graves filled, the city's spirit endured, fragile but unyielding. German commanders had believed that the siege would force Leningrad to its knees within weeks, but as the first winter dragged on, their strategy of starvation faltered. The city did not surrender. It clung to life in the face of calculated annihilation. Reports from the front described Soviet resistance stiffening, not collapsing, despite the famine. Hitler's hopes of freeing divisions for the Moscow offensive dwindled as the Red Army continued to hold the city's lines. Leningrad's suffering, meant to crush morale, instead became a rallying point for Soviet propaganda, a symbol of endurance against fascist cruelty. Abroad, the plight of the city drew sympathy, reinforcing the Soviet Union's role as a critical ally. Hunger, though it claimed hundreds of thousands, did not achieve its intended political purpose. Instead, it became proof of resilience, a demonstration that even the cruelest weapon could not erase the will to survive. By the spring of 1942, the death toll from hunger had reached catastrophic levels, yet the city still endured, clinging to fragile lifelines of hope. Lake Ladoga, frozen in winter and navigable in summer, offered the only route for supplies to trickle in and evacuees to escape. The infamous Road of Life across ice and water became the artery that prevented total annihilation, though at enormous human cost. For now, however, hunger remained the defining feature of daily existence, a silent battlefield that claimed more lives than bullets or shells. The citizens of Leningrad lived on the edge of extinction, each meal a victory, each sunrise another defiance. The Germans had sought to weaponize hunger, but in doing so they created a tragedy that history would never forget. And in that tragedy lay the seeds of Leningrad's legend, a story not just of survival, but of unbroken defiance against impossible odds. By the winter of 1941, with the city starving and the German ring nearly impenetrable, salvation could only come from the east, across the vast expanse of Lake Ladoga. This inland sea, frozen solid under sub-zero temperatures, offered the Soviets a desperate chance to maintain contact with the besieged city. Military engineers, under constant artillery fire, surveyed the ice and marked crude paths for vehicles. It was a gamble fraught with risk, for the ice cracked under weight, and German bombers prowled the skies above. Yet it was the only artery by which food, fuel, and ammunition could trickle into Leningrad. The road across Ladoga quickly earned its legendary name, the Road of Life. Each truck that set out across the frozen lake carried not only supplies, but also the fragile hope of a city on the brink of starvation. With every journey, the balance between survival and annihilation hung in the freezing air. The convoys that formed to cross Ladoga became a testament to Soviet improvisation under impossible conditions. Trucks rattled across the ice in single file, headlights blacked out, guided only by dim lanterns and whitewashed poles planted in the snow. The drivers, many barely out of their teens, were ordered to maintain distance, for a concentrated load could shatter the ice and send them plunging into the freezing depths. Engines groaned in the bitter cold, oil thickening in the cylinders, and tires threatened to split against jagged cracks. As the winter winds howled, men huddled in cabins wrapped in sheepskins, their breath crystallizing in the air, their knuckles frozen against steering wheels. Some trucks broke through thin patches of ice, vanishing into black water with no chance of rescue. The journey was measured in fear, determination, and sheer endurance, repeated day after day, night after night, as the lifeline to Leningrad stayed open against all odds. Every ton of food that arrived through the Road of Life meant survival for thousands, though the amounts were heartbreakingly small. Grain, flour, and tinned meat were packed into warehouses and ration offices, providing minimal sustenance to civilians clinging to existence. Fuel, carried in drums strapped to sleds, kept power stations alive and factories running just enough to produce ammunition. Ammunition itself traveled in the opposite direction, replenishing the city's guns that thundered defiantly against German artillery. At the same time, the road was used not only for supplies entering, but for people escaping. Children, the sick, and the elderly were evacuated in long lines of trucks. Families were torn apart at checkpoints, parents weeping as their children were sent away into the freezing night, their survival uncertain, but their departure necessary. To Leningraders, the Road of Life was both a passage of hope and a corridor of heartbreak. For many, it became the dividing line between life in the starving city and a chance, however slim, to endure beyond its walls. German forces understood the significance of Ladoga, and did everything in their power to sever it. Bombers from the Luftwaffe swooped down to strafe the ice road, their machine guns spitting death at drivers racing for cover. Stukas dropped bombs that cracked the frozen surface, swallowing convoys whole in sudden geysers of water and fire. Artillery batteries on the lake's southern shore unleashed barrages, shelling the thin ice to destroy it before trucks could pass. Soviet anti-aircraft gunners, shivering in makeshift positions, fired back with what little ammunition they could muster, often too weak from hunger to keep up sustained barrages. The lake became a battlefield in its own right, where the weapon was not territory but survival, measured in calories and convoys. Each crossing was a gamble, a duel between human endurance and calculated German destruction. The fact that the road remained open was nothing short of a miracle of courage and organization. As the seasons changed, the road of life adapted to the lake's shifting nature. In summer, barges replaced trucks, hauling supplies across waters under constant threat from German aircraft and artillery. Pilots of the Luftwaffe scoured the lake for vulnerable targets, sending flames and wreckage to the depths. Soviet sailors fought to protect the convoys, their small craft braving shells and bombs in missions as vital as any frontline battle. When winter returned, engineers rebuilt the ice road, laying fresh markers and adjusting routes to avoid weakened areas. The cycle of freezing and thawing made Ladoga both a savior and a tormentor, as Soviet planners prayed the ice would hold long enough to sustain the city. Each year the road demanded new sacrifices, new drivers, and new measures of courage. It was a cycle of suffering that embodied the siege itself, relentless, brutal, and yet enduring. For the drivers of the road of life, each mission was a test of bravery, unlike any other in the war. Many were young women, hastily trained and sent behind the wheels of trucks, their hands numb and faces frozen by winds that cut like blades. Their diaries and recollections reveal fear mixed with resolve, knowing their cargo meant survival for tens of thousands. Some recalled hearing the ice groan beneath them, a sound that haunted dreams long after the war ended. Others spoke of the silence of the lake at night, broken only by the rumble of engines and the occasional scream of an aircraft overhead. Those who survived often did so through luck as much as skill, while those who perished left no trace but bubbles rising in the frozen blackness. To them the road was not only a duty, but a burden of unimaginable weight. Each journey across Ladoga was a gamble against death. For the civilians evacuated across the road of life, the experience was no less harrowing. Children were bundled into trucks, clutching small bags of possessions, not knowing if they would ever see their families again. Mothers wept on the shores of the city, forced to let go of sons and daughters to save them from starvation. Many children reached safety in the east, though some perished along the way, victims of cold, hunger, or bombing raids. For the elderly, the journey was often too much, and their bodies were carried off the trucks before they could reach safety. Yet for all its horror, the road carried nearly 1 million people out of Leningrad over the course of the siege, preserving generations that might otherwise have been lost. It was as much an artery of life for those leaving as it was for those who remained behind. The road of life was not merely logistics, it was humanity in motion, battered but unbroken. By the time the siege finally ended, the road of life had taken on a legendary status in Soviet memory. It had sustained the city when all seemed lost, bringing in just enough to keep its defenders fighting and its civilians breathing. Though tens of thousands died along the route, the road symbolized the stubborn defiance of Leningrad itself. It showed that the Germans could never entirely sever the will to survive, no matter how tightly they closed their ring. In every loaf of bread, in every sack of flour, in every evacuated child, the road declared that Leningrad still lived. And so the road of life became more than an ice path across a frozen lake. It became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the fragile but unyielding thread of survival that bound the city to the rest of the Soviet Union. Its legend endures because it was the difference between total annihilation and the possibility of victory. Even in a city reduced to starvation, freezing in the dark with corpses in the streets, culture remained a weapon of defiance as powerful as any rifle. For Leningrad, home to the Mariinsky Theatre, the Hermitage, and countless artists, music and art became lifelines that nourished the spirit when food could not nourish the body. In the depths of the siege, radio broadcasts carried not only news but also poetry, orchestral fragments, and uplifting words meant to remind citizens that they were more than victims. Writers scribbled in frozen rooms, hands trembling from hunger, preserving the experience of a people under siege. Theatre companies staged performances by candlelight, with actors fainting on stage, yet continuing their lines, because the performance itself was a declaration of survival. Painters captured images of breadlines, bombed streets, and hollow-eyed neighbors, transforming tragedy into a visual testimony for history. For Leningrad, culture was not a luxury, it was a lifeline, a reminder of identity, pride, and unbroken human dignity. At the heart of this cultural resistance stood composer Dmitri Shostakovich, whose Seventh Symphony was born amid the thunder of German shells. He began composing it in the autumn of 1941, working by lamplight as air raid sirens echoed across the city. To Shostakovich, the symphony was more than music. It was a weapon forged in notes and chords, meant to defy the invader who sought to erase his city. He envisioned it as a piece that could both mourn and inspire, capturing the suffering of the people while rallying them to endurance. Drafts of the score were carried to safety, while Shostakovich himself posed in firefighting gear for Soviet propaganda, embodying both the artist and the defender. The Leningrad Symphony, as it came to be known, quickly transcended its birthplace, becoming a symbol of defiance for all who heard it. In every measure it carried the pain, resilience, and unyielding spirit of the besieged city. The Philharmonic Orchestra of Leningrad, scattered and starving, faced the monumental task of bringing this symphony to life. Many musicians were gone, dead, evacuated, or serving at the front, and those who remained were emaciated, barely strong enough to hold their instruments. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, himself weak and ill, scoured the city to assemble a ragged group of survivors. Musicians were recalled from military units, some carrying rifles as they returned to pick up violins and clarinets. Rehearsals took place in freezing halls, musicians fainting mid-piece from hunger, yet refusing to abandon the effort. The orchestra rehearsed slowly, painfully, yet with growing determination, each note hammered out against despair. In the bleak spring of 1942, they prepared to deliver not just a concert but a cultural victory of historic proportions. The performance on August 9, 1942, became one of the most extraordinary events of the war. Loudspeakers were rigged across the city, so that even starving civilians and soldiers in trenches could hear the symphony. Soviet artillery coordinated barrages to silence German guns during the performance, creating a fragile pocket of quiet in a city otherwise under constant bombardment. As the orchestra played, the sound traveled beyond the city walls, reaching German lines where astonished soldiers listened to the defiant music of those they sought to annihilate. Within the Philharmonic Hall, the audience wept openly, their tears a mixture of grief, pride, and unbreakable resolve. For those who attended, the concert was more than music. It was proof that the city still lived. Each crescendo defied the silence of death. Each melody declared that Leningrad's soul could not be starved into submission. The Seventh Symphony quickly became a cultural weapon on a global scale, carried beyond Leningrad to Allied nations. Microfilm copies of the score were smuggled out, performed in London, New York, and other cities, where audiences responded with awe and solidarity. For the Allies, it was evidence of Soviet endurance, a cultural bridge linking democratic nations with their Eastern partner in a shared struggle against fascism. Radio broadcasts of the symphony echoed across continents, ensuring that Leningrad's plight was not forgotten. The music carried the sound of resistance far beyond the city's frozen streets, transforming a local act of defiance into a global symbol of courage. In this way, Shostakovich's symphony became not only Leningrad's anthem, but a voice for humanity's refusal to yield to tyranny. Yet music was only one strand of the cultural resistance that thrived amid the ruins. Poets scribbled verses in diaries that captured the hunger, grief, and stubborn hope of their neighbors. Painters recorded stark, haunting images of breadlines, bombed-out apartments, and children with hollow eyes, creating a visual archive of suffering and endurance. Theatre troupes staged plays, sometimes in basements or makeshift shelters, their audiences wrapped in blankets, shivering yet transfixed. These cultural efforts may have seemed insignificant against tanks and artillery, but they reminded citizens of their shared humanity. They kept alive a sense of identity, a belief that the people of Leningrad were more than statistics in Hitler's plan of extermination. Every poem, every painting, every whispered story was an act of defiance against annihilation. Even in homes darkened by blackouts, culture became a means of survival. Families recited poems to children as they shivered in their beds, distracting them from hunger pains. Songs passed from mouth to mouth, whispered in breadlines, or sung softly in factories, binding the community with shared memory and resilience. For many, these cultural moments were as vital as rations of bread, offering nourishment for the spirit that starvation could not extinguish. In diaries and memoirs, survivors later recalled that it was not only calories that kept them alive, but the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. Leningrad was not just a city fighting to survive, it was a symbol of human endurance, carved not only in steel and fire but in art and music. Thus, cultural resistance became a fortress no German could breach, as essential to survival as the guns on the front lines. The city's defenders wielded violins, pens, and paintbrushes as weapons, proving that even under siege creativity could flourish. In a world of silence and starvation, these voices created sound, meaning, and memory that defied death. The Philharmonic's performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony epitomized this resilience, standing as one of the greatest acts of defiance in modern history. Culture gave Leningrad something the enemy could not touch, the conviction that the city's soul remained alive. And so, even in the darkest winter, music and art declared Leningrad would not fall. When the German blockade descended on Leningrad in September 1941, it did not distinguish between soldier, worker, or child, and the youngest citizens quickly became the most vulnerable. Children who had once filled schools, playgrounds, and theaters now stood in endless breadlines, their small hands clutching ration cards as tightly as toys once held. They faced hunger, cold, and disease with bodies too frail to resist and spirits too young to understand the enormity of war. Their diaries, preserved against all odds, reveal a heartbreaking mixture of innocence and awareness, describing not only death and hunger, but also games played in the rubble. Many were too weak to walk, carried by parents through frozen streets, wrapped in blankets or sacks to shield them from the icy winds. Childhood illnesses that had once been survivable became death sentences when combined with famine and cold. Yet in their faces one could still glimpse flickers of curiosity, laughter, and resilience, reminders of life clinging on amid destruction. The story of the siege is incomplete without the voices of its children, for they carried both its deepest scars and its most fragile hopes. Evacuation efforts began almost immediately, as Soviet authorities sought to save as many children as possible from certain death. Trains carried thousands out of the city in the early months of the war, though many were bombed along the way, leaving tracks littered with wreckage and lost lives. As the German ring tightened, evacuation became far more dangerous, relying on the treacherous road of life across Lake Ladoga. Children were loaded onto trucks, sometimes without their parents, clutching small bundles of clothes or favorite toys as their only possessions. Mothers wept on the icy shoreline, forced to watch sons and daughters vanish into the night, uncertain if they would survive the crossing. For those who made it, safety lay in distant villages, orphanages, or foster homes in the Soviet interior. Yet for every child evacuated, another remained behind, trapped in the city of hunger and bombs. The separations left deep wounds, many never to be healed, as families were broken apart by necessity and war. Inside Leningrad, orphanages became overcrowded sanctuaries of desperation, where children huddled together in freezing dormitories. Food was as scarce there as in the rest of the city, and the cries of hungry infants echoed through dark, unheated halls. Caregivers, often starving themselves, struggled to maintain a semblance of routine, teaching lessons by candlelight or reciting poems to distract their wards from gnawing hunger. Disease spread quickly in such close quarters, claiming lives day by day, while the living buried the dead in shallow graves behind orphanage walls. Yet even in such bleakness, moments of tenderness emerged, as older children protected the younger, sharing rations or stories to ease the fear. Some drew pictures of bread, sunshine, or flowers, creating fragile windows into a world beyond starvation. These orphanages became both places of unimaginable suffering and reservoirs of remarkable resilience, where childhood clung stubbornly to life. The diaries of children provide some of the most haunting testimonies of the siege, their words simple yet devastating in their honesty. One such diary, that of Tanya Savicheva, recorded in brief, childlike sentences the deaths of her family members one by one. Each page bore witness to the shrinking circle of her world until only she remained, embodying the collapse of an entire generation under siege. These writings, unadorned and direct, pierce through time, giving voice to those who could not survive to tell their stories. They remind us that behind the staggering statistics lay individual lives with names, dreams, and laughter stolen by war. Their diaries are not only documents of suffering, but monuments to resilience, showing how even the youngest found words to resist silence. For historians, they have become priceless testimonies, but for survivors, they remain painful echoes of a stolen childhood. Each line is both a record and a cry, demanding remembrance. Daily survival for children who remained in the city was a grim education in endurance. Bread became the currency of life, and children learned early that a single crust meant the difference between waking and never rising again. Schools, when they functioned, taught lessons in freezing classrooms where students fainted from hunger before blackboards scribbled with patriotic slogans. Bombing raids drove children into cellars, where games were improvised in the dark, while shells thundered overhead. They carried water from icy rivers, hauled firewood, and even worked in factories, their small hands turning machinery to keep the city alive. Play did not vanish entirely, but it became tinged with the surreal, as snowball fights took place amid ruins, and games of make-believe revolved around food and warmth. Childhood in Leningrad was reshaped into survival, where resilience replaced innocence and endurance replaced play. In every small act, they carried the burden of a war they had never chosen. Despite the devastation, culture and education were maintained for children wherever possible, as acts of defiance against despair. Teachers continued lessons, even if only to a handful of students, believing that knowledge was a form of survival. Music classes persisted with voices too weak to hold notes, yet still determined to sing. Pioneers, the Soviet youth organizations, carried out morale-boosting activities, trying to keep children connected to community and purpose. Even stories told at night became powerful tools, keeping hope alive in young minds that otherwise knew only hunger and death. These efforts were not trivial. They were deliberate strategies to preserve humanity in the next generation. They showed that even under siege, childhood could not be entirely extinguished, that the spirit of Leningrad's youngest remained alive through creativity and learning. In this way, education and culture became lifelines of the mind, parallel to the road of life that sustained the body. The Germans, intent on starving the city into submission, underestimated the resilience of its children. Despite propaganda that predicted collapse within weeks, the younger generation endured nearly 900 days of siege alongside their elders. Their survival was a victory in itself, a direct refutation of Hitler's plan to erase the city's population. Many children grew into adults who would later recall the siege not as a tale of despair, but as a lesson in strength and endurance. For them, every childhood memory was bound to survival, every game framed by hunger, and every lesson marked by loss. Yet those memories also testified to an unbreakable spirit, to the refusal of innocence to be crushed entirely by war. In their survival lay the seeds of Leningrad's future, proof that life could continue even when death seemed absolute. The children of the siege became its most poignant symbol, embodying both its suffering and its resilience. In the end, the endurance of children in besieged Leningrad was not merely survival. It was defiance against annihilation. Their lives, fragile and fleeting, carried the weight of the city's future, ensuring that Leningrad would not vanish from history as Hitler intended. Though thousands perished, their voices live on in diaries, drawings, and memories passed down by survivors. Those who endured carried with them scars deeper than any battlefield wound, yet also a testimony that human will could outlast cruelty. To speak of the siege without them is to miss its most human dimension, the story of innocence forced to confront horror, and yet refusing to be entirely destroyed. The children of Leningrad were not only victims of the blockade, they were symbols of endurance that outlived Hitler's empire. Their story remains one of the most haunting and powerful legacies of the war, echoing across generations as a reminder of both tragedy and hope. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, Army Group North was given the monumental task of advancing through the Baltic states and eliminating Leningrad as a major Soviet stronghold. Commanded initially by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, the group comprised the 16th and 18th Armies, supported by Panzer Group 4 under Erich Huppner. Their advance was swift, overwhelming the Red Army defences in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and by early September they were within sight of Leningrad's outer defences. For von Lieb, the prize was not only strategic, but also symbolic. Capturing the city of Lenin would deal a shattering psychological blow to the Soviet regime. Yet even as his forces closed the ring, questions arose in Berlin about what to do with the city once it was surrounded. To the soldiers on the front, Leningrad looked like a fortress too vast and populous to be stormed without catastrophic losses. The German High Command began to consider alternatives to direct assault, ones that aligned with Hitler's darker vision of conquest. Adolf Hitler's orders concerning Leningrad revealed the genocidal intent underlying his entire campaign in the East. To him, Leningrad was not simply a military target, but a center of Bolshevik ideology that deserved complete eradication. He declared in unequivocal terms that the city was not to be captured and occupied, but destroyed, erased from the map of Europe. In directives issued to the Wehrmacht, Hitler demanded that the population be left to starve, warning his commanders against taking responsibility for feeding millions of civilians. He justified this in terms of logistics, arguing that the German army could not spare supplies for a city of 3 million, but his reasoning was steeped in ideological hatred. For Hitler, annihilation of Leningrad was both practical and symbolic, a cleansing of what he saw as the heart of Soviet communism. This order tied the hands of commanders and dictated a siege of deliberate starvation rather than a conventional conquest. It was an act of war that blurred into an act of mass murder. Field Marshal von Lieb, a professional soldier of the old school, struggled with the brutal clarity of Hitler's instructions. He recognized that storming Leningrad would cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of thousands of casualties, given its fortifications, river barriers, and the sheer number of defenders. Yet he also knew that leaving a massive enemy population behind German lines posed grave risks to the stability of their position. In correspondence and staff meetings, he raised concerns about the feasibility of starving the city into submission, especially given the determination of Soviet resistance. But von Lieb was no rebel, bound by obedience to the Führer. He carried out the orders to encircle and isolate Leningrad without attempting a direct assault. His staff began to draft logistical plans for a blockade that would stretch on indefinitely, dependent on cutting off supplies by land, lake, and air. In this sense, the siege was less a battlefield strategy and more an experiment in annihilation through hunger. The German army itself was ambivalent about this new form of warfare, which placed soldiers in the role of passive executioners. Many frontline officers privately expressed doubts about the morality and practicality of starving millions of civilians. Reports trickled back describing the sight of refugees fleeing the city, bombed and shelled on the open roads, often mown down by artillery fire to prevent escape. Wehrmacht soldiers who encountered these civilians saw starving women and children, but orders were clear. No aid was to be given, no supplies shared, and no mercy shown. The responsibility weighed heavily on some commanders, though others accepted Hitler's directives with ruthless efficiency. The army, designed for blitzkrieg and rapid conquest, now found itself holding a static line, watching famine do its work. This created frustration within the ranks, for soldiers trained to fight saw themselves reduced to jailers of an entire city. In practice, the siege became a test of ideological obedience as much as military endurance. The Luftwaffe played its part in enforcing Hitler's strategy, raining bombs on food warehouses, rail depots, and water supplies. One of the first targets destroyed in the September bombardments was the Barbarossa warehouses, Leningrad's main grain storage, setting ablaze reserves that could have fed the population for months. The destruction was celebrated in German reports as a decisive step in accelerating the city's collapse through hunger. Bombers also targeted Lake Ladoga, seeking to sever the road of life before it could be fully established. For the Luftwaffe, success was measured not only in destroyed tanks or guns, but in the starvation of civilians denied their bread. It was warfare conducted against kitchens, bakeries, and queues, intended to extinguish resistance by extinguishing sustenance. This systematic targeting showed that the German command understood the siege not as a conventional military contest, but as an exercise in extermination. When Field Marshal Georg von Küchler replaced von Lieb in early 1942, the strategy remained unchanged, though its futility was becoming evident. Küchler inherited a front stretched thin and demoralized, holding a line against Soviet counterattacks, but unable to deliver the decisive blow. By then, the Red Army had fortified Leningrad's defenses, and the population, though starving, had not surrendered. Kukla attempted to tighten the blockade with further attacks on supply lines, yet his soldiers were also suffering from shortages and the harsh northern climate. His role became one of maintaining a stalemate that drained German strength while failing to achieve Hitler's dream of annihilation. The longer the siege dragged on, the more it exposed the limits of starvation as a military weapon. Leningrad was not collapsing. It was enduring, fueled by a combination of stubborn resilience and fragile lifelines. For Kukla, the siege became a war of attrition that consumed his army as much as the city. The German perspective was also shaped by the larger context of Barbarossa, where priorities shifted rapidly with the unfolding campaign. As Hitler diverted panzer units south to Ukraine and then toward Moscow, Army Group North found itself deprived of resources for a decisive strike on Leningrad. The siege became a sideshow in a larger strategic picture, maintained because Hitler insisted on erasing the city, but neglected because the Eastern Front demanded manpower elsewhere. German soldiers stationed before Leningrad saw themselves locked into a static, costly position, unable to advance and forbidden to retreat. This fostered resentment and disillusionment as they endured bitter winters in trenches with little sense of purpose beyond starving civilians. For them, the war before Leningrad became less a conquest than an endless vigil, watching a city that refused to die. The failure to resolve the siege quickly reflected the contradictions of Hitler's strategy, grand in vision, brutal in intent but fatally flawed in execution. From the German perspective, the Siege of Leningrad was meant to be a swift and decisive stroke, an ideological triumph to crown the northern flank of Barbarossa. Instead, it became a quagmire that consumed resources, tested morale, and revealed the limits of starvation as a tool of conquest. Hitler's refusal to storm the city spared the Wehrmacht massive casualties, but it condemned them to wage a war of hunger that ultimately failed to break Soviet resistance. Commanders like von Lieb and von Kukla carried out their orders, but their armies were drawn into a campaign with no clear end and no decisive victory. For the Germans, Leningrad was supposed to symbolize the destruction of Bolshevism, but it instead became a monument to their own failure and cruelty. The plan to starve the city into oblivion did not annihilate Leningrad. It immortalized it as a symbol of defiance, and in that failure lay the seeds of Germany's greater defeat on the Eastern Front. As the siege tightened its grip, the winter of 1941 descended on Leningrad with a ferocity unmatched in living memory. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees, turning the city's canals into frozen highways of ice and its homes into tombs of cold. Fuel supplies, already scarce, had long been exhausted, leaving apartments unheated and pipes bursting into solid columns of ice. Families huddled together in the corners of their rooms, wrapping themselves in whatever rags and blankets could be found. Breath crystallized in midair, frost creeping along walls and ceilings like an invading army. Even the simplest tasks, such as fetching water or lighting a stove, became ordeals that drained what little energy starvation had left. The cold did not simply add to the hunger, it sharpened it, accelerating weakness and death in ways no bomb or shell could match. The first winter of the siege became the city's cruelest tormentor, an enemy without face or uniform. Fuel shortages transformed daily life into a desperate scavenger hunt for warmth. Firewood vanished quickly, and soon citizens turned to furniture, smashing chairs and cupboards to feed the last flames of life. Libraries were plundered not for knowledge but for survival, their shelves stripped of books that became fuel for stoves. Priceless volumes of Russian literature, works of Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, fed fires that burned for only minutes before dying out. Even the wooden frames of houses were dismantled piece by piece, weakening structures but offering fleeting relief against the biting cold. Families scavenged construction sites and abandoned buildings for scraps of timber, while in parks trees were cut down to stumps in the mad search for heat. Yet no amount of scavenging could match the scale of the cold, and most homes remained freezing tombs, their residents entombed alive in frost. Fire became a rare, fragile miracle, one that could vanish in an instant, leaving only the cold. Water, the most basic necessity, became another daily battle against nature. With pipes frozen solid, residents trudged to the Neva River or nearby canals, axes in hand, to hack through thick ice for access to liquid. The journey itself was exhausting, made more perilous by German shelling and aerial attacks that targeted civilians as mercilessly as soldiers. Buckets of water, heavy and unwieldy, had to be hauled through snow by starving bodies already at the brink of collapse. Many collapsed en route, their buckets spilling, their bodies freezing into statues on the streets. In winter's harshest weeks, the sight of frozen corpses clutching pails became tragically common, grim reminders of the cost of survival. Those who succeeded returned home with precious water that often froze again before it could be boiled. Life in Leningrad was reduced to such cruel ironies, where even water, so abundant in normal times, became a deadly challenge. The cold claimed its victims in silence, leaving the city littered with frozen bodies. Factories, the lifeblood of Leningrad's defense, struggled to function amid the deadly freeze. Workers labored in sub-zero conditions, machines seizing up for lack of lubricants that had turned to sludge. Yet weapons and ammunition continued to roll off the lines, assembled by skeletal figures in overcoats, their breath fogging in the icy air. Many collapsed at their benches, unable to continue, only to be replaced by others equally weak but determined to keep production alive. The sacrifice of these workers ensured that Leningrad's guns could still fire, its tanks still roll, even as the city starved and froze. But the cost was measured in thousands of lives, spent like ammunition to keep the war machine running. Factories became both crucibles of endurance and chambers of suffering, places where human will clashed with hunger and cold in battles as fierce as those fought on the front. Their output was more than steel. It was survival itself, forged in frost and death. Food, already scarce, became almost impossible to prepare in homes without fuel for cooking. Families chewed frozen bread like stone, gnawed at raw scraps of potato or sawdust-laced flour. Soups were concocted from wallpaper paste, boiled leather, or ground-up animal bones scavenged from refuse piles. Even these grotesque meals required fire, and when firewood was gone, many ate cold and raw, their bodies too weak to resist infection. Hunger and cold combined into a relentless cycle. Starvation weakened the body's defenses, while the cold consumed its last reserves of energy. Children wasted away in cribs surrounded by frost, their cries weakening into silence before fading entirely. Parents faced the unthinkable choice of giving their last scraps to their children, or sharing them to survive together. The cold made every meal shorter, every night longer, every life closer to its end. Death became the companion of every family, waiting patiently in the dark. The streets of Leningrad told a story of frozen despair that words could scarcely capture. Corpses lay uncollected for days, sometimes weeks, stiff and half buried in snowbanks, their outlines blurred by the winter drifts. Sledges pulled by surviving relatives carried bodies to mass graves, their silent processions winding through the city like ghostly funerals. Dogs and cats had long since disappeared, either eaten or perished, leaving only silence and the crunch of boots in the snow. Tramlines stood frozen, their cars immobilized, filled with lifeless passengers who had succumbed to cold and hunger mid-journey. The city itself became a morgue, its streets an open graveyard where survival seemed less a triumph than a postponement of the inevitable. Yet within this bleakness, life clung on in stubborn defiance, for those still alive refused to abandon the fight. Leningrad became a city of the dead, but also a city that refused to die. Amid this horror, stories of human resilience shone like fragile lanterns in the darkness. Neighbors shared scraps of wood or fragments of coal, pooling resources to kindle fires that could warm several families at once. Children recited poems in freezing classrooms, their voices trembling but determined to preserve normalcy. Orchestras, skeletal but unbroken, performed for audiences wrapped in coats and blankets, offering warmth of spirit when no physical warmth could be found. Writers documented the horrors with frozen fingers, ensuring that the world would one day understand the scale of their suffering. These acts, small but profound, defied both cold and hunger by asserting the dignity of survival. They proved that even in temperatures that froze rivers solid, the human spirit remained unbreakable. Culture, solidarity, and defiance became weapons more powerful than firewood, burning brightly against the long night of winter. By the end of that first winter, more than 500,000 Leningraders had perished, victims not of bullets, but of cold and hunger. The German strategy of starvation had inflicted unimaginable suffering, but it had failed to break the city's will. The survivors who emerged from the winter of 1941-42 were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and traumatized. Yet they were also hardened, united by the knowledge that they had endured the worst. The city itself had shrunk into a skeletal version of its former self, its streets empty, its homes frozen, yet its heart still beating. For the Germans, the winter had not delivered the collapse they expected. Instead, it forged Leningrad into a symbol of unyielding resistance. The coldest hunger had tested the city to its limits, but it had not conquered it. From this crucible of frost and famine, Leningrad emerged a city scarred but defiant, ready to face the next chapter of its ordeal. Even as the people of Leningrad starved and froze within their city's walls, Soviet high command sought desperately to break the German noose from without. In late 1941, as Operation Barbarossa lost its momentum, the Red Army launched counterattacks in multiple sectors, hoping to force Hitler's armies into retreat. The Northern Front became a priority, for the fall of Leningrad would mean not only the destruction of Soviet industry, but also the loss of a city bound to the revolution itself. General Georgy Zhukov, transferred north after his triumph in defending Moscow, understood that relieving the city was as much a political necessity as a military one. He pressed exhausted Soviet armies into attack against battle-hardened German divisions, even when the odds were forbidding. These counterstrokes were meant not just to relieve the city, but to prove to its starving people that they were not forgotten. In this way, the Soviet counteroffensives became lifelines of hope, though their cost was measured in blood. The first major effort came at Tikhvin, a rail hub east of Leningrad that held the key to vital supply routes. German forces had seized the town in November 1941, threatening to sever Soviet links to the east and tighten the siege further. The Red Army responded with ferocious determination, throwing divisions battered by months of retreat into the snowbound forests. Men marched through waist-deep drifts, poorly clothed with rifles freezing in their hands, yet they pressed on with relentless resolve. Soviet artillery pounded the German lines, their shells often falling short or wide in the confusion of winter storms. Yet sheer weight of men, combined with the Germans' growing supply shortages, eventually forced the Wehrmacht to abandon Tikhvin in December. It was one of the first Soviet victories of the war, though it was achieved at terrible cost in lives. Tikhvin's recapture restored a tenuous lifeline to the besieged city, though its relief was more symbolic than substantial. With Tikhvin retaken, Soviet hopes turned southward toward the Volkhov River, where another effort was made to cut through the German lines. The Volkhov front, composed of conscripted divisions and newly raised formations, launched repeated offensives in swampy, forested terrain. Conditions were appalling, with men wading through marshes, their uniforms soaked and freezing in sub-zero temperatures. German strongpoints, fortified with machine guns and mortars, turned every advance into a bloodbath. Still, Soviet commanders drove their troops forward, determined to pry open even the smallest corridor to Leningrad. Bridges of logs and ice were built across the Volkhov under fire, only to collapse beneath men and vehicles. By January 1942, the offensive had stalled, with divisions shattered and survivors retreating into the woods. It was a tragic demonstration of courage clashing with brutal reality, leaving fields littered with bodies frozen in place. The battles at Volkhov exposed the grim mathematics of the Eastern Front, where human waves often met immovable defenses. Soviet troops attacked with inadequate artillery preparation, charging across open ground against entrenched German positions. Casualties were staggering, with entire regiments disappearing in hours of combat. German divisions, though stretched thin, proved adept at defense, using minefields, barbed wire, and interlocking fields of fire to tear apart advancing Soviet units. Soviet commanders rotated fresh units into the fight, but the results remained the same: gains of meters paid for with hundreds of lives. Even so, each assault tied down German reserves and inflicted attrition that the Reich could ill afford. The Soviets understood this, accepting horrendous losses to keep the Germans from concentrating forces elsewhere. For Leningrad's defenders, these bloody offensives meant the siege remained a strain on the enemy as well. In Leningrad itself, news of the Tikhvin victory was broadcast widely, serving as a lifeline of morale. Newspapers, thin and ragged, carried headlines declaring that the German tide had been halted and the city would be saved. Radio speakers, powered by dwindling electricity, repeated stories of Soviet troops reclaiming ground and pushing westward. Civilians, shivering in their homes, clung to these reports as proof that the outside world had not abandoned them. Many believed that relief was only weeks away, though reality proved otherwise. The Volkhov battles had cost tens of thousands of lives, yet delivered little progress. Still, the symbolism mattered, for hope was as essential as bread in keeping the city alive. Soviet propaganda magnified every success, no matter how small, into a promise of eventual liberation. In this way, even defeats fed the endurance of the besieged. German commanders, meanwhile, watched the Soviet counterattacks with unease. They had expected the Red Army to collapse entirely during the winter of 1941, yet instead found themselves forced into defensive battles across frozen marshes. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieber, commander of Army Group North, reported heavy losses and the strain of holding a front far longer than anticipated. Supply shortages gnawed at the Wehrmacht, with trucks and horses perishing in the cold as fuel ran dry. The Germans maintained their siege, but their confidence in a swift Soviet collapse faded with each costly counterattack. Reports of Soviet resilience filtered back to Berlin, where Hitler raged at his generals for failing to crush the enemy. For the first time, the German High Command began to realize that the Soviet Union was not a collapsing colossus, but an enemy that would fight to the death. The cost of these offensives for the Red Army was staggering, with casualty lists numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Many divisions ceased to exist, their survivors scattered or absorbed into new units. Hospitals in the rear were overwhelmed with frostbitten, malnourished and wounded soldiers, most too weak to ever return to combat. Yet the Soviet state counted these sacrifices as necessary, for every German division held before Leningrad was a division not driving toward Moscow or the Caucasus. The Red Army was learning the harsh art of modern war, adapting tactics through trial, error, and immense suffering. While the counteroffensives failed to break the siege, they bought time and inflicted attrition that would later prove decisive. It was a grim exchange, but one Stalin and Zhukov accepted without hesitation. In the ledger of war, the Soviet Union paid in blood what it lacked in preparation. By the spring of 1942, the siege remained unbroken, but the Red Army had proved it would not relent. The battles at Tikhvin and Volkhov were not triumphs in the conventional sense, but they showed that the Germans could be forced to retreat, however briefly. For Leningrad, the city of Lenin, this meant survival through another season, however bleak. The cost had been devastating, leaving scars on families across the Soviet Union as news of losses trickled home. Yet the offensives had ensured that Hitler's dream of seizing the city quickly would never be realized. The siege dragged on, transforming into a contest of endurance that neither side could easily abandon. For the people within Leningrad, each Soviet attack beyond the walls, however bloody, carried the promise that one day the blockade would be broken. It was not victory yet, but it was defiance carved into the frozen soil of Russia. From the autumn of 1941 onward, the thunder of German artillery became a grim soundtrack to life in Leningrad. Army Group North had positioned its guns on the outskirts of the city, with batteries perched on the Polkovo heights and other commanding ground. From these positions they could rain shells on factories, rail yards, and even the very heart of the city itself. The barrage was relentless, often striking without warning, scattering shrapnel across streets already emptied by fear. Bread lines became death traps, with civilians cut down as they waited for their meager rations. Homes and apartments collapsed into rubble, leaving families buried beneath the ruins. Even iconic landmarks, from the spires of churches to the grand facades of palaces, bore scars of artillery fire. The bombardments were not merely tactical, they were psychological, designed to grind down the will of the city. Each day the people of Leningrad lived with the knowledge that a shell could claim them at any moment. Above the city, the skies roared with the menace of the Luftwaffe. German bombers droned over Leningrad by day and by night, seeking to destroy its industry and break its spirit. The massive Kirov plant, which still produced tanks under siege conditions, became a constant target, struck again and again despite workers laboring under fire. The Badayev warehouses, where precious food reserves were stored, were obliterated in September 1941, turning tons of grain into smoking ash. Bombs fell on power stations, leaving entire districts shrouded in darkness during the long nights of winter. Civilians huddled in stairwells and cellars, listening to the whistle of falling ordnance and the crump of detonations. The air defenses of Leningrad fought valiantly, with anti-aircraft batteries and fighter planes darting overhead, but they could not stop every raid. The raids struck not only military targets, but also schools, theaters, and hospitals, scattering death indiscriminately. For the people, each air raid siren was both a warning and a reminder of their fragile existence. Life in the city adapted, as survival required new rhythms and strange routines. Families dug makeshift shelters in courtyards, transforming basements into communal bunkers where neighbors gathered during shelling. Underground stations of the Leningrad metro became sanctuaries, filled with mattresses, stoves, and the low murmur of whispered prayers. In these subterranean havens, the population forged bonds of solidarity, sharing bread crusts and news in the dim glow of lanterns. Schools relocated to cellars, where children learned their lessons while plaster dust drifted from the ceilings. Factories, too, were relocated below ground, with machinery clanking in damp basements where workers toiled as shells thundered overhead. Life continued beneath the earth, even as the surface above became a wasteland of shattered glass and cratered streets. It was a city that had learned to breathe underground, clinging to existence beneath a canopy of fire. Yet even underground, the danger never truly ceased. Shock waves from nearby detonations shook the walls, sending chunks of masonry tumbling into the cramped shelters. The smell of smoke seeped into every corner, mingling with the stench of unwashed bodies and kerosene lamps. Ventilation was scarce, and the air grew thick and oppressive as families crowded together for hours on end. Children whimpered from fear and hunger, their cries muffled by mothers who feared attracting panic. Outside, rescue brigades rushed from one impact site to another, digging frantically through rubble to free those buried alive. Firefighters worked without rest, dousing flames with little more than buckets of water in freezing winds. For many, the decision to remain above ground or seek shelter below was a gamble with fate. Some died crushed beneath their homes, others asphyxiated in shelters that collapsed. Survival was never guaranteed, only borrowed with each passing hour. The Germans targeted breadlines deliberately, knowing the sight of the starving struck down in desperation would cripple morale. Eyewitnesses recalled how shells landed with terrifying precision, tearing through queues of women and children waiting for their daily ration. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the metallic tang of blood, a grotesque symbol of hunger weaponized by war. Survivors scattered, clutching loaves in their hands, sometimes dropping them in panic, only to scramble back amid the dead to retrieve them. For those who lived through it, the trauma of waiting in line became as great a burden as hunger itself. Still, people returned, day after day, because bread meant survival, however small the ration. The city's leaders understood this and attempted to vary distribution points, but the Germans adapted just as quickly. Thus, feeding the population became not only a logistical struggle, but also a deadly gamble under fire. Factories, astonishingly, continued their work, even as bombs and shells tore at their walls. The Kirov plant, though struck repeatedly, rolled out tanks that were sent straight to the front lines. The city's workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored with frozen fingers, patching machinery by torchlight. They worked amid broken windows and ceilings that let snow drift onto the production lines. Their labor was fueled not by adequate food, but by willpower, often sustained on no more than 125 grams of bread a day. At night, workers doubled as fire brigades, rushing to extinguish incendiary bombs before they consumed entire blocks. The Soviet state glorified their efforts, but the truth was grimmer: a city whose workers labored themselves to death so the fight could continue. Industry had become part of the front line, and each machine produced was a blow struck in defiance. Leningrad's factories became as vital as its trenches, producing hope from ruin. For the Germans, the bombardment was a campaign of attrition designed to break the city without direct assault. Hitler forbade storming Leningrad, preferring instead to starve and shell it into submission. Artillery consumed tens of thousands of shells, and bombers flew countless sorties, but still the city held. German reports spoke of fires rising from the skyline, of the Neva River frozen and blackened with smoke. They imagined the city collapsing within weeks, yet months turned to years without victory. The persistence of Leningrad baffled them, for they underestimated both its resilience and its symbolic weight. What they saw as bombardment was in truth forging a legend of defiance. Every shell that landed hardened the will of the survivors, who refused to yield. In seeking to destroy the city with bombs, the Germans instead immortalized its endurance. Inside Leningrad, the bombardments became part of daily existence, woven into the rhythm of survival. Children grew accustomed to the whistle of shells, sometimes mistaking them for storms passing overhead. Families measured their days between air raid sirens, counting time in the silences between attacks. Artists sketched by candlelight, their drawings etched with the jagged silhouettes of ruined streets. Musicians carried instruments into shelters, playing softly to drown out the rumble of explosions above. Priests whispered prayers in cellars, offering solace to those who wondered if morning would come. The people of Leningrad did not merely endure the bombardment, they adapted, reshaped their lives to exist within its thunder. This adaptation was itself a form of defiance, a refusal to let terror define them. The city lived under fire, but it lived nonetheless. In Leningrad's hour of desperation, women became the backbone of survival, taking on roles that stretched far beyond tradition. With so many men at the front, women stepped into hospitals, factories, and defense works with little more than courage and necessity to guide them. Nurses and doctors, many scarcely out of school, worked in freezing wards where the wounded were wrapped in blankets thin as paper. In factories, women operated heavy lathes, forged artillery shells, and assembled rifles under the whistle of incoming bombs. Others donned uniforms, serving as anti-aircraft gunners or manning searchlights to spot enemy bombers in the night skies. Their labor was carried out while half-starved, often with children waiting at home in cold apartments. Yet the demands of war left no choice. Survival required sacrifice in every form. In this crucible of siege, Soviet women emerged not as auxiliaries but as warriors of resilience. In the hospitals, the strain on women medical workers was relentless, their hands trembling with exhaustion as they performed surgeries without anesthesia. Blood froze on floors, and supplies ran out faster than they could be replenished, forcing nurses to sterilize bandages by boiling them repeatedly. Women carried stretchers through shell fire, dragging the wounded from rubble-strewn streets into makeshift wards. At night, the sound of artillery mixed with the quiet moans of soldiers clinging to life. Many nurses were barely older than the men they tended, yet their composure under pressure saved countless lives. They improvised splints from floorboards, tourniquets from torn sheets, and stretchers from doors ripped off hinges. Their work was both physical and emotional, offering words of comfort to men who knew they might never rise again. Each act of care was defiance, proof that even amid devastation, humanity endured. In the hospitals of Leningrad, compassion became its own form of resistance. Factories became another battlefield, their assembly lines filled with women who worked from dawn until well into the night. The Kirov plant and other armament centers relied on women machinists, welders, and laborers to keep the Soviet war machine alive. They operated in freezing conditions, where breath misted in the air and frost coated the machinery. They struggled to keep running. Production targets were impossibly high, yet failure was never permitted, for every shell or tank was needed at the front. Women balanced their work with hunger, their daily bread ration barely sustaining their bodies through grueling shifts. Some collapsed at their machines, fainting from exhaustion, only to return after a brief rest to continue. Their efforts kept the Red Army armed and ready, even as bombs shattered walls around them. To many, the factory floor was as dangerous as the front lines, yet they persevered. In these crucibles of steel, women forged victory, one weapon at a time. On the front itself, women also played roles as lethal as they were courageous, joining the ranks of snipers and partisans. Soviet ideology embraced women fighters, training them to handle rifles, crawl through forests, and hunt German soldiers with deadly precision. Female snipers, such as the famed Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko, though stationed outside Leningrad, symbolized the deadly skill and resilience women brought to the battlefield. In and around Leningrad, women crept into ruined buildings, and waited for hours, their rifles steady in the snow, their patience unshakable. Each shot they fired carried not just tactical value, but also psychological weight, reminding the enemy that no soldier was safe. Beyond snipers, women joined partisan bands in the forests around the city, sabotaging German supply lines and passing intelligence. They endured the same dangers as men, risking torture or execution if captured. Yet they fought, motivated by vengeance, survival, and patriotism, embodying the fierce defiance of a nation under siege. Air defense became another arena where women shouldered enormous responsibility, manning anti-aircraft batteries and searchlights across the city. Young women, many barely 20, directed beams of light across the skies, tracking bombers as flak shells burst overhead. Others loaded shells into the guns, their shoulders aching under the strain of constant fire. Anti-aircraft crews often worked in sub-zero temperatures, their fingers numb as they rammed ammunition into smoking barrels. German pilots soon learned that Leningrad's skies were not undefended, and many bombers fell under the guns of these women warriors. Their success was paid for with blood, as crews were often targeted by enemy strafing runs and bombardments. Still, they returned to their posts night after night, knowing that each enemy plane destroyed meant lives spared below. In the skies above Leningrad, women were guardians, their vigilance part of the city's shield. Their courage illuminated the night, even when the city itself lay in darkness. Away from the battlefield, women bore the unbearable burden of keeping families alive in conditions that defied human endurance. They stood for hours in frozen bread lines, clutching ration cards as shells fell around them. They boiled wallpaper to scrape off the starch, feeding children broth from what once decorated their homes. Some bartered precious possessions, rings, books, heirlooms for a handful of flour or potatoes. In apartments where temperatures plunged below freezing, women bundled their children in every scrap of clothing, whispering lullabies while hunger gnawed at their own stomachs. They buried their husbands, brothers, and sons, then returned to work the next morning because life demanded it. Their grief was a private wound, endured silently in a city where death was everywhere. Each act of survival, from lighting a stove with scraps of wood to securing a crust of bread, became a victory against despair. For the women of Leningrad, endurance was both duty and destiny. Cultural life, too, often rested on the shoulders of women, who maintained schools, theatres, and libraries even as shells rained down. Teachers held lessons in basements, their chalk squeaking across boards, while explosions rattled walls above. Librarians guarded precious books, loaning them to readers seeking escape in literature as much as knowledge. Actresses and musicians performed in shelters, lifting spirits with plays and concerts that defied the reality of siege. Mothers encouraged children to write diaries, preserving their voices for posterity in a world that seemed intent on silencing them. These efforts, though seemingly small, preserved the soul of the city. They reminded the people of who they were and what they were fighting for. In the darkness of siege, women nurtured culture as well as survival. Their resilience was not just physical, but also spiritual, a refusal to allow war to erase identity. They became custodians of memory, even as the present crumbled around them. In every corner of besieged Leningrad, from the hospitals to the trenches, from the factories to the homes, women bore the weight of war. They carried stretchers through shell fire, forged steel with frozen hands, aimed rifles at the enemy, and rocked hungry children to sleep in bomb shelters. Their sacrifices were as vast as they were varied, yet their stories often remained overshadowed by the broader sweep of military history. Without them, the city could not have endured, nor could the Red Army have held its lines. They embodied resilience in its purest form, sustaining a city through compassion, labor, and defiance. In their faces, one saw the determination of an entire nation refusing to bow. The Siege of Leningrad was not merely a story of armies and generals, but of women who fought in every way possible. They were not the silent victims of war, but its unyielding survivors and quiet heroes. By the time the second winter of the siege descended on Leningrad, the city was already drained of strength and hope. The hunger of the first winter had left deep scars, yet the promise of quick relief had evaporated in the face of brutal reality. Snow blanketed the ruins of shattered buildings, muffling the sound of distant artillery, but offering no comfort to those huddled inside. Temperatures once again plunged to deadly lows, freezing pipes, wells, and the very breath in people's lungs. Families gathered around stoves without fuel, burning books, chairs, and even wallpaper for a few moments of heat. Rations remained desperately low, often no more than a scrap of bread made from sawdust and flour substitutes. Children with hollow cheeks and swollen bellies roamed streets in search of crumbs, their eyes dulled by hunger. Hospitals filled not only with the wounded, but also with the starving, who wasted away in silence. The second winter carried with it not shock, but a crushing familiarity with despair. The city's defenses endured the same shortages, forcing soldiers to fight under conditions that would have broken lesser armies. Men in the trenches wore uniforms patched with rags, their boots stuffed with paper to block the snow. Ammunition ran low, and weapons often froze in the bitter cold, yet they held the lines with grim determination. Entire units lived on watery soups of cabbage or horse meat, when it could be found at all. At night the crack of rifles echoed across frozen fields, but hunger sapped the strength needed to mount serious attacks. German artillery still pounded the city daily, their shells tearing through neighborhoods reduced long ago to rubble. Even the simplest act of defending the city required superhuman will, for soldiers fought not just the enemy but their own bodies. Still, the Red Army around Leningrad refused to retreat, knowing the city's survival depended on their endurance. This stalemate became a test of who could outlast the other in a war of attrition. Inside Leningrad, the suffering of civilians reached new depths as starvation claimed thousands more lives. Diaries from the winter of 1942-43 describe bodies lying uncollected on the streets, frozen where they fell during desperate searches for food. Entire apartment blocks grew silent as families perished together, too weak even to rise from their beds. Survivors shrank into shadows of themselves, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their voices faint. The daily struggle was not merely for sustenance, but for dignity. As hunger stripped away layers of humanity, people still lined up for bread rations in endless queues, even knowing the bread would be little more than a lump of bitter filler. Each ration card became as precious as life itself, guarded against theft or loss with desperate care. Rumors of cannibalism resurfaced, whispered in shame but acknowledged as an unspoken truth of survival. The city had become a graveyard, yet it still breathed. For those who endured, survival became the ultimate act of defiance. Yet amid this bleakness, the road of life across Lake Ladoga continued to pulse as the city's fragile artery of survival. Convoys of trucks braved enemy fire, crossing the frozen surface of the lake under constant threat from German bombers. Drivers often steered across black ice in blizzards, their headlights dimmed to avoid detection, trusting only faint marks scratched into the surface. Many never returned, their vehicles plunging through the ice into the dark waters below. Yet each truck that reached Leningrad carried sacks of flour, barrels of fuel, or boxes of ammunition that meant another day of resistance. The road also carried civilians away from the dying city, evacuating tens of thousands, mostly children and the elderly, to safety beyond the siege. Every journey was perilous, but without it the city could not have endured even a week longer. For the people of Leningrad, the road of life was not just a supply route, but a fragile thread binding them to hope. It symbolized the city's refusal to surrender, even in its darkest hour. The second winter was also marked by the collapse of illusions that the siege might soon end. Propaganda continued to promise breakthroughs from Soviet offensives, but most attempts to cut through the German lines ended in failure. Families clung to these announcements with desperate belief, only to be disappointed again and again as months dragged on. The realization that the siege might last for years, not weeks, settled over the city like another layer of frost. Many lost faith in promises of relief, and instead turned inward, focusing on the daily rituals of survival. Even those rituals, however, required extraordinary strength, as gathering water from the Neva or chopping ice became life-threatening tasks. Still, the stubborn rhythm of existence continued, proving that resilience could exist even in hopelessness. For the survivors, each day was counted, not in achievements but in the simple act of living one day more. Leningrad had become a city where survival itself was victory. Among the ruins, culture again became a weapon of endurance, sustaining minds when bodies faltered. Theatres reopened in cellars, with actors performing to audiences wrapped in blankets, their applause muffled by hunger. Musicians played in half-frozen halls, their fingers stiff but their music soaring above the thunder of artillery. Painters sketched the devastation, capturing both the suffering and the indomitable spirit of the city. Writers kept diaries that chronicled not just despair but also small acts of courage, from sharing bread to braving shellfire for water. These cultural sparks offered moments of humanity amid the inhuman conditions, keeping alive a sense of identity beyond mere survival. To Stalin's state, such acts also carried propaganda value, proving that Leningrad still lived. But to those within the city, they were far more than that. They were reminders of dignity, spirit, and the reason to endure. In this way, art became both shield and sustenance. The city of Lenin refused to be silenced. For the Germans, the siege in its second winter also posed difficulties, as attrition began to sap their strength. Supplying Army Group North grew increasingly difficult, with partisans sabotaging railways and Soviet offensives tying down reserves. Soldiers in German trenches suffered frostbite and hunger as well, though not to the catastrophic degree of the city they surrounded. Hitler's insistence on starving Leningrad into submission meant no decisive assault, but also no quick victory. German officers grumbled in their diaries about the endless watch, the cold, and the stubborn refusal of the city to collapse. They fired their artillery daily, yet saw no signs of surrender, only of endurance. The stalemate drained morale as much as it drained resources, leaving them trapped in their own way. The siege, meant to crush Soviet resistance, instead tied down vast German forces in a war of endurance. By the second winter, it was clear that the plan to starve the city quickly had failed. As the winter of 1942-43 drew to a close, Leningrad remained in ruins but unbroken. Its survival an act of defiance, unmatched in modern war. Tens of thousands more had died, yet the city still stood, its factories producing, its soldiers fighting, and its people clinging to life. Hope was no longer tied to promises of quick relief, but to the sheer endurance of a population that refused to yield. The road of life had kept the city breathing, even if only barely, proving that determination could outlast starvation and cold. For the Soviets, Leningrad became more than a military struggle. It was a symbol of national spirit, a beacon of survival in the darkest winter. For the Germans, it was a reminder of the Soviet will, that no artillery could shatter. The second winter did not bring liberation, but it brought clarity. Leningrad would not die. The siege continued, but so too did the unyielding heart of the city. By the winter of 1943, the siege of Leningrad had dragged into its 600th day, and the city's survival hung on the knife edge of endurance. Starvation and cold had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, yet the will to resist endured in both the besieged population and the Soviet high command. Stalin and his generals knew that simply holding on was not enough. The blockade had to be broken, or the city might one day finally collapse. The task fell to the Leningrad front, and the Volkhov front, commanded by Generals Leonid Govorov and Kirill Merezhkov. Their mission, codenamed Operation Iskra Spark, was to smash through the German lines south of Lake Ladoga. The objective was limited but vital: create a narrow land corridor between the city and the rest of the Soviet Union. To the defenders of Leningrad, it was the promise of breath after 2 winters of suffocation. The plan focused on a narrow strip of land between the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and the Neva River. Here the German 18th Army had entrenched deeply, holding bunkers, minefields, and barbed wire across marshy terrain. The Soviets would attack from 2 directions, westward from the Volkhov front and eastward from the Leningrad front, with the goal of meeting near the village of Schlisselburg. Success required coordination rarely achieved in earlier offensives, for timing was everything. The Red Army massed artillery batteries in silence, moving guns at night to avoid German reconnaissance. Trains carried ammunition through the frozen forests, while sappers prepared to clear paths through mine belts. Soldiers, many hardened by years of siege and hunger, knew the risks but also the necessity of this operation. For them, Iskra was not simply another battle, it was the key to Leningrad's survival. On January 12, 1943, the offensive began with an artillery barrage that shook the frozen ground like thunder. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, unleashing shells that turned German positions into fields of fire and smoke. The bombardment lasted for nearly 2 hours, a rolling wall of steel intended to shatter defenses before infantry advanced. When it lifted, waves of Soviet soldiers stormed forward, their boots crunching on snow hardened by sub-zero temperatures. Machine gun nests spat fire, cutting down men in the open, yet the advance did not stop. Tanks groaned across the ice, their treads slipping as shells burst around them. Engineers followed close behind, clearing mines with their hands or with bayonets in the snow. Casualties mounted quickly, but the offensive pressed onward. In the roar of battle, hope clung to every step toward the enemy trenches. German resistance was ferocious, for Hitler had ordered the siege maintained at any cost. The 18th Army, though weakened, fought with discipline, using fortified bunkers and interlocking fields of fire to stall the Soviet advance. Every hamlet and frozen forest clearing became a battlefield, defended by machine guns and artillery hidden under snow. German counterattacks were swift, with reserves rushing to seal breaches before they widened. Soviet troops fell by the hundreds, their bodies lying on the ice as comrades pressed past them. The battle became a brutal struggle of attrition, measured in meters gained at staggering cost. Yet for the first time, Soviet forces fought with a level of coordination and determination that the Germans could not entirely blunt. After 2 days of heavy fighting, the Soviet pincers began to close, narrowing the gap between them. The road to Schlisselburg remained open, but only just. On January 18th, after nearly a week of relentless combat, Soviet units from both fronts linked up near the ruins of Schlisselburg. The meeting of their forces was celebrated with gunfire and shouts, though the ground around them was littered with the dead. The corridor carved was narrow, barely 8 to 10 miles wide, but it was a lifeline nonetheless. Engineers immediately began work to build a supply route, laying tracks for a rail line across the frozen earth, even as artillery boomed in the distance. Within days, the first trains crept along the newly built Victory Road, bringing flour, ammunition, and medicine into Leningrad. The city, though still under siege, was no longer completely cut off. For the first time in nearly a year and a half, hope surged within its battered walls. Operation Iskra had lived up to its name, a spark of salvation in the darkness. The impact inside the city was immediate, though conditions remained dire. Civilians lined the streets to watch the first convoys arrive, tears freezing on their cheeks as they saw sacks of food and barrels of fuel. Rations increased slightly, giving families a few more grams of bread each day, enough to stave off death for thousands. Hospitals received supplies of medicine that had long been absent, allowing doctors to save lives rather than simply watch patients waste away. Workers at the Kirov plant and other factories gained renewed energy, their efforts bolstered by the knowledge that the siege was not unbreakable. For soldiers on the front lines, the corridor meant reinforcement and resupply, lifting morale after months of despair. Still, no one doubted that the fight was far from over. The Germans remained close, their artillery still able to strike the city. Leningrad was breathing again, but the noose still pressed hard. For the Germans, Operation Iskra was a sobering blow that undermined their aura of invincibility around Leningrad. Reports from the 18th Army revealed divisions mauled and reserves stretched thin, their lines fraying under the pressure of Soviet coordination. Hitler raged at his generals, demanding counteroffensives to seal the breach, but the Wehrmacht no longer had the strength for decisive blows. Instead, the siege transformed from total encirclement into partial blockade, a shift that eroded the psychological dominance the Germans once held. German soldiers, themselves exhausted by the endless cold and attrition, saw the Soviet ability to build a railway under fire as proof of a relentless enemy. For Berlin, the failure to maintain the full blockade marked yet another turning point in a war increasingly tilting against them. The dream of starving Leningrad into submission had been broken. Yet for all its success, Operation Iskra did not end the siege. It only loosened its grip. The corridor was narrow and constantly under German artillery fire, making it perilous to use. Supplies flowed into the city, but never in the abundance truly needed to restore normal life. Hunger still stalked the streets, and shells still fell daily, killing civilians and destroying homes. The people of Leningrad rejoiced at the Lifeline, but they knew liberation was still a distant goal. Operation Iskra was a victory, but a costly and incomplete one, earned through rivers of blood. It showed that the Soviet Union had regained the initiative, but also that breaking the siege entirely would demand even greater sacrifice. For Leningrad, survival was no longer merely about enduring, it was about fighting forward 1 mile at a time. The spark had been lit, but the fire of liberation still smoldered beyond the horizon. Even as shells fell, and hunger stalked every street, the people of Leningrad clung to daily rituals that gave rhythm to survival. Diaries from children and adults alike reveal a life balance between despair and determination, recorded in handwriting that often trembled from weakness. Entries spoke of bread, the measure of life in grams, weighed and guarded as if it were gold. They wrote of death, not in abstract numbers, but in the loss of neighbors, relatives, and strangers frozen in doorways. Yet alongside the grim notes came descriptions of sunlight glinting on ice, or the joy of hearing that rations had increased by even a few grams. These fragments remind us that survival was not only about enduring hunger, but about retaining humanity. In each diary line, we see the paradox of siege life, despair intertwined with stubborn hope. Words became a way to resist, preserving the voice of a city under annihilation. Bread remained the central obsession, both as sustenance and symbol of life itself. Families cut their rations into precise portions, sometimes stringing pieces on thread to ration them across the day. The bread was dark, coarse, and often mixed with sawdust or other fillers, yet it carried the taste of salvation. Long queues formed before bakeries, where people shivered for hours, terrified of shells that often targeted these gatherings. To lose a ration card was a death sentence, and theft of one could destroy a family's chance at survival. Diaries record the relief of holding a crust in one's hand, chewing it slowly to prolong the moment. Bread united all classes and professions, for generals and factory workers alike depended on the same ration system. Its scarcity shaped every thought, dream, and plan, making food not only physical but psychological fuel. The bread line became the front line of endurance. Even as death surrounded them, life's ordinary milestones continued, for people refused to let war erase the human calendar. Schools operated in basements and shelters, where teachers wrapped in shawls lectured children huddled in coats. Lessons were often interrupted by air raid sirens, forcing pupils to crouch in the dark until the danger passed. Weddings took place in apartments, sometimes celebrated with nothing more than a small loaf shared among the guests. Young couples married quickly, seeking comfort and certainty in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Funerals, by contrast, became hurried, with bodies often buried in shallow graves or collected in mass pits. Priests and family members recited prayers softly, for the dead were too many to linger long in mourning. Life and death stood side by side, inseparable companions of a city under siege. The extraordinary blended into the ordinary as survival demanded adaptation. Children, though frail and hungry, remained at the heart of the city's endurance, embodying both innocence and resilience. Some were evacuated across Lake Ladoga, leaving behind parents who wept with both relief and fear. Those who remained often kept diaries that capture a child's unfiltered perception of horror. Tanya Savicheva, one of the most famous, listed the deaths of her entire family in heartbreaking simplicity, ending with the words, "Everyone is dead, only Tanya is left." Her diary became a symbol of the siege, representing countless children whose lives were cut short by hunger. Yet children also played in rubble-strewn courtyards, fashioning toys from scraps, pretending that normal life still existed. Teachers encouraged them to draw or write, preserving innocence as best they could. Each child's survival was a victory, a defiance of a war that sought to erase generations. In their laughter and tears, the spirit of Leningrad endured. The arts, even in ruin, persisted, offering a fragile refuge from despair. Theatres reopened in cellars, staging plays to audiences bundled in coats, their applause faint but sincere. Musicians performed in bombed-out halls, their violins and pianos competing with the rumble of distant artillery. Painters sketched scenes of devastation and hunger, capturing the reality of siege life with haunting precision. Libraries, though stripped of warmth and light, remained open, with citizens borrowing books to escape into other worlds. Poetry readings were held by candlelight, words echoing in spaces that once housed laughter and lectures. These cultural acts were not luxuries, they were lifelines, restoring dignity and reminding people of what they were fighting to preserve. In the face of hunger, art provided nourishment of another kind, feeding the spirit when the body faltered. Through culture, Leningrad resisted not just destruction but erasure. Factories, remarkably, continued to operate, their output sustaining the Red Army even as workers themselves starved. Women, teenagers, and the elderly worked endless shifts, building shells, rifles, and tanks under conditions that would seem impossible. Workshops lacked heating, so workers wore coats and gloves, while operating machinery covered in frost. Malnourishment claimed many lives on the factory floor, yet production quotas were still met, driven by patriotism and coercion alike. Diaries tell of workers collapsing mid-shift, revived with a sip of hot water before returning to their stations. Repairs were constant, as German shells regularly struck industrial districts, forcing crews to rebuild under fire. The clang of hammers and roar of lathes became a counterpoint to the thunder of artillery. To the outside world, Leningrad was a starving city, but it was also an arsenal. Its survival was tied not only to endurance but to output. Each weapon forged a blow against despair. Faith, too, provided a thread of strength for many, even under a regime hostile to religion. Churches that survived bombardment became places of quiet refuge, where prayers rose alongside the smoke of burning candles. Priests ministered to congregations wrapped in rags, whispering hope where ideology demanded silence. Some families maintained icons hidden in their apartments, gathering around them at night to pray for bread and survival. Others found faith in the cause of socialism itself, repeating slogans as mantras of endurance. Whatever form it took, belief gave structure to suffering, transforming chaos into sacrifice with meaning. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were conducted in secrecy or simplicity, stripped of grandeur but heavy with significance. Even in hunger, people clung to rituals of faith, for they offered a sense of continuity beyond destruction. Religion and ideology coexisted uneasily, but both gave strength to endure. In this tension lay the complexity of survival in Leningrad. Daily life amid ruin was not marked by great victories, but by small triumphs of survival, repeated day after day: a sip of hot soup, a loaf shared among neighbors, a concert in a basement. All became acts of defiance. The city adapted to catastrophe, transforming survival into a form of resistance as powerful as any army. Diaries captured these moments, freezing them in time as testimony for the world to remember. Schools, marriages, funerals, and factories all continued, reshaped but unbroken, proving that life did not stop even when death was everywhere. For Leningrad, this ordinariness in extraordinary times was itself remarkable. The siege was not just a story of hunger and shellfire, but of humanity clinging to itself. Every act of daily life became a declaration the city would not be erased. Amid ruin, Leningrad lived, and that survival was its greatest victory. In the bitter cold of January 1944, the Soviet High Command unleashed the long-awaited Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, a massive effort to end the city's nightmare once and for all. After 2 years of attrition, the Red Army had rebuilt its strength, integrating Siberian divisions hardened by winter warfare and troops seasoned by the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. Marshal Leonid Govorov commanded the Leningrad front, while Marshal Kirill Meretskov led the Volkhov front, their armies striking in coordinated fashion against exhausted German positions. The offensive began on January 14th, with artillery barrages so intense that survivors described the earth as shaking like thunder. German defensive lines, stretched thin and weakened by constant losses, could not withstand the storm of Soviet fire. Panzer divisions, once proud of their strength, now lacked fuel, ammunition, and replacements. For the Germans, the front became untenable, with their positions buckling under relentless Soviet pressure. The long siege was nearing its end, and both sides sensed the shift in momentum. The Soviets attacked with overwhelming numerical superiority, a stark reversal of 1941, when they had been outmatched and disorganized. Over 1.25 million Red Army soldiers, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, and aircraft, surged forward along a wide front. Their goal was not merely to push the enemy back, but to break the blockade entirely, smashing German positions that had strangled Leningrad for 872 days. Across frozen rivers and snowbound forests, Soviet infantry advanced cautiously yet relentlessly, paying dearly for each kilometer. At Krasnoye Selo, after fierce fighting, Soviet troops liberated the area that had long served as a German staging ground for bombardments. Villages burned and bunkers shattered as the Red Army pressed toward the main German defensive belts. Soldiers carried the memory of Leningrad's hunger with them, vowing vengeance for every life lost to starvation. The offensive combined strategic precision with raw determination, the culmination of years of planning and suffering. The Germans, under the command of Army Group North, attempted to hold but were trapped by Hitler's stubborn refusal to allow retreat. Field Marshal Georg von Küchler had long warned Berlin that holding Leningrad was no longer feasible, but his pleas were dismissed. German divisions, already weakened by constant fighting, were ordered to stand fast despite collapsing defenses. Soviet breakthroughs at multiple points forced them into chaotic withdrawals, exposing their flanks to encirclement. Morale plummeted as the myth of German invincibility crumbled under Soviet guns. For soldiers who had once marched to the gates of Moscow, this was now a desperate struggle simply to survive. Abandoned artillery, wrecked vehicles, and frozen corpses littered the snow-covered fields. The Wehrmacht, once a juggernaut, was unraveling in the face of Soviet power. Hitler's refusal to accept reality condemned thousands of his men to destruction. The siege lines that had once seemed immovable were disintegrating hour by hour. In Leningrad itself, the thunder of artillery shifted tone, carrying the sound not of bombardment, but of liberation. Citizens huddled in cellars listened as the bombardments that had once targeted them moved steadily westward. Hope, long buried beneath hunger and despair, began to stir as news of Soviet advances trickled into the city. By January 18th, the Red Army had achieved decisive breakthroughs, forcing German troops into a retreat they could no longer disguise. Streets once deserted by hunger, now filled with cautious crowds, people daring to believe that the nightmare was ending. Workers in factories increased output despite exhaustion, knowing their weapons were now pushing the enemy away rather than merely holding them at bay. Children, gaunt and frail, watched soldiers march westward, cheering with voices too weak to rise above a whisper. For the first time in years, the horizon promised freedom instead of famine. Leningrad was awakening from its long dark night. When Soviet troops entered liberated areas, they were met with scenes of horror that mirrored their own city's ordeal. Villages along the former siege lines lay in ruins, their populations decimated by starvation, executions, or forced labor. German occupation policies had left a trail of devastation, with farms stripped bare and survivors half dead from hunger. Soldiers discovered mass graves, shattered homes, and the remnants of communities erased by war. Yet they also found civilians who had clung to life, greeting the Red Army with tears and embraces. Liberation was not just military, it was deeply human, a rescue of people from the edge of extinction. For many Soviet soldiers, this reinforced the righteousness of their struggle, giving the offensive a moral weight beyond strategy. They were not merely expelling invaders, they were ending a policy of extermination. Each liberated village became a testimony to the cost of German occupation. The war in the north had revealed its true face. On January 27, 1944, after 872 days of blockade, the Soviet Union officially declared the Siege of Leningrad lifted. The announcement echoed across radio broadcasts, reaching every household that had survived the ordeal. The city erupted in celebration, though its people were too exhausted to do more than wave flags and embrace one another. Fireworks lit the sky above the battered skyline, a display of light over ruins still scarred by shellfire. Survivors wept openly, mourning those who had not lived to see the day. Soldiers marched proudly through streets lined with citizens who looked like shadows of their former selves, their faces gaunt but radiant with relief. Stalin ordered a 324-gun salute in Moscow, the thunder of cannons marking not just a victory, but vindication. For Leningrad, liberation did not erase the suffering, but it ended the sentence of starvation. The city had endured, and now it was free. The liberation of Leningrad had immense strategic consequences for the war in the east. With Army Group North driven back hundreds of kilometers, the Soviet Union secured its vital northern flank. The Red Army could now redirect forces to press offensives deeper into the Baltic states, threatening Germany's hold on Eastern Europe. The psychological impact was equally profound. The city that Hitler had vowed to erase had survived, defying both his ideology and his armies. Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience, its endurance celebrated alongside the victories of Moscow and Stalingrad. For the German people, news of the retreat shattered confidence, further eroding faith in a war already turning against them. For the Allies, it was proof of the Soviet Union's strength and staying power, reinforcing the unity of the Grand Alliance. Strategically, politically, and morally, the lifting of the siege was a decisive turning point. It marked the shift from defense to relentless Soviet advance. Yet liberation did not bring immediate relief from suffering, for the scars of the siege ran deep. Hundreds of thousands had perished, their absence haunting every street, home, and family. The city's infrastructure lay in ruins, with factories, power plants, and housing devastated by years of bombardment. Malnutrition and disease lingered among survivors, whose bodies had been pushed to the edge of endurance. The road of life across Lake Ladoga remained in use, not for desperate survival, but for bringing in food and rebuilding materials. Doctors, engineers, and workers began the colossal task of reviving a city that had endured the unendurable. Yet amid the rubble, there was a renewed determination. Leningrad would live again. The lifting of the siege was not only the end of a nightmare, but the beginning of resurrection. Out of hunger and ruin, the city would rise as a monument to resistance, sacrifice, and survival. The Siege of Leningrad stands as one of the darkest yet most defining chapters in the history of the Second World War. Over 1 million civilians perished, not from bullets or bombs, but from hunger, cold, and disease. The sheer scale of death transformed the city into a vast graveyard, with frozen bodies lining the streets and silent apartments filled with the dead. These losses were not statistics but shattered families, children buried in shallow graves, and generations cut short in the name of survival. Yet through this unimaginable suffering, the city endured, its people refusing to surrender despite every hardship. The endurance of Leningrad became a weapon in itself, denying Hitler the victory he craved. What was meant to be an extermination turned into a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The story of the siege became etched into Soviet identity, a scar and a source of pride in equal measure. It was not merely survival, it was defiance turned into history. The siege's death toll ranks among the worst civilian tragedies in modern warfare, rivaling the most destructive bombings and genocides of the era. For comparison, the civilian losses in Leningrad exceeded the combined deaths of British and American civilians during the entire war. Hunger, more than shells, was the true killer, and it claimed its victims slowly day after day. Entire families starved together, diaries chronicling their final meals reduced to crusts of bread or boiled wallpaper paste. Cannibalism, though rarely spoken of, was a grim reflection of how far human desperation could be driven. Yet in the midst of death, acts of solidarity persisted, neighbors sharing their last crumbs, doctors treating patients until they collapsed, children writing diaries that would one day speak for the silenced. The tragedy of Leningrad was not faceless but deeply personal, preserved in testimonies and memories passed down through generations. Every lost life became part of a collective story of endurance. For the Soviet leadership, the survival of Leningrad was both a strategic and ideological triumph. Stalin had ordered the city to hold at all costs, and its endurance validated his uncompromising stance. The city remained an industrial engine even under siege, producing weapons and munitions that fed the war effort. Workers, half-starved, still turned lathes and assembled tanks, proving that even in near-death conditions, Soviet industry did not collapse. Propaganda elevated the siege into legend, presenting it as proof of the superiority of the Soviet system and the will of its people. The Philharmonic's performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, broadcast through loudspeakers to soldiers and citizens alike, symbolized the union of art, endurance, and defiance. The siege was transformed from catastrophe into a narrative of heroism that would shape Soviet memory for decades. It was not only a battle of armies, but a test of ideology, with survival itself as the ultimate victory. In the wider war, the endurance of Leningrad carried immense consequences for both sides. For Hitler, the failure to capture the city marked a strategic dead end, a drain on resources that achieved nothing. Army Group North was pinned for years, tying down divisions that might have fought at Moscow, Stalingrad, or Kursk. German soldiers who once believed they were invincible found themselves frozen and starving before the city they could not take. For the Allies, the survival of Leningrad became further proof of the Soviet Union's resilience, reinforcing trust that the Eastern Front was bleeding Germany dry. The siege also became a symbol abroad, with reports of civilian suffering stirring sympathy in London and Washington. Though distant, Leningrad's ordeal influenced Allied perceptions of the war and the urgency of opening a second front. It became part of the global narrative of resistance to fascism, a story that extended far beyond Soviet borders. The legacy of the siege endured most strongly in the city itself, where memory became inseparable from daily life. After the war, monuments rose on Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, where mass graves held hundreds of thousands of victims. Eternal flames and solemn processions turned the cemetery into sacred ground, a place where survivors and descendants gathered to honor the dead. Streets still bore the scars of bombardments, while apartment blocks carried plaques reminding passers-by of where bombs fell and lives ended. Survivors carried their trauma with them, yet they also carried pride in having endured what seemed impossible. The memory of starvation, loss, and resilience shaped Leningrad's identity for generations. The siege was not just history, but a living memory, written into the stones, the songs, and the silence of the city. For those who lived, every meal, every warm home, and every child's laughter was a reminder of what had been lost and what had been preserved. The cultural impact of the siege reached far beyond military or political significance, becoming a symbol of human willpower in the face of annihilation. Literature, diaries, and music from the siege years preserved the voices of those who endured, ensuring their suffering would not be forgotten. Tonya Savicheva's diary, a child's account of her family starving one by one, became one of the most poignant testimonies of the siege. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony became immortalized as the Leningrad Symphony, a piece that spoke for the entire city under siege. In art and memory, Leningrad was transformed from victimhood into resilience, its survival celebrated as much as mourned. These cultural echoes ensured that the world would know not just of death, but of dignity amid despair. The siege became both a tragedy and a testament, an example of how culture itself could resist destruction. In memory, Leningrad remained unbroken. Internationally, the memory of the siege has continued to shape perceptions of the war in Russia and abroad. In the West, it is often overshadowed by Stalingrad or D-Day, yet historians recognize it as one of the longest and most brutal sieges in modern history. For Russians, however, it remains central, a story not only of victory, but of martyrdom. Veterans and survivors became honored witnesses, their testimonies repeated in classrooms, parades, and ceremonies. The city, renamed back to St. Petersburg in the 1990s, still holds commemorations each January, marking the lifting of the blockade. Generations who never lived through the siege still carry its memory as part of national identity. It serves as both a warning and a source of pride, reminding Russia of the costs of war and the strength of endurance. On the world stage, the siege stands as a reminder of the extremes of human suffering and the resilience that can emerge in its wake. The legacy of Leningrad's siege is therefore twofold. It is both a wound and a monument. The million who died are mourned, their suffering a permanent reminder of the cruelty of war. Yet the survival of the city, against every odd, remains one of the most powerful symbols of resistance in history. Leningrad showed that even in the face of calculated extermination, a people could endure, rebuild, and ultimately prevail. Its memory carries with it not just sorrow, but also a defiant pride that transcends generations. In the quiet of memorial cemeteries, in the notes of Shostakovich's symphony, and in the voices of descendants who still tell the story, the spirit of Leningrad endures. The siege is no longer merely a military chapter, it is a lesson in human resilience. And as long as its memory is preserved, the city's sacrifice will continue to echo through time, reminding the world of both the horrors and the strength of the human spirit.